He wished he could say something helpful, but he couldn't think of a single useful thing to say about night wings. "At least you're not a rain wing," he tried. "Did Marusir say anything about Glory?" Starflight frowned at him over the edge of the rock. "Not much. He said, 'Don't worry about the rain wing. I'll take care of it.'" Clay felt a cold chill climb up through the stone floor and spread through his scales. "What does that mean? What's he going to do?" "How should I know?" Starflight poked his nose back into the scroll. "Maybe she'll get to go home. She's probably the luckiest of all of us." The pulse of fear pounding in Clay's head disagreed. He couldn't see the Guardians just releasing Glory, not after all the years of secrecy. "We have to go spy on them," he said, jumping to his feet. "We have to know what they're planning." He stopped halfway out of the cave and stamped one foot in frustration. "Oh no, we can't. Marusir will know we're there." "Right," Starflight said. "He'll hear you thinking all your big, loud, worried thoughts." "You don't know that my thoughts are loud and worried," Clay said. "Maybe they're quiet and very serene." Starflight snorted with amusement, the first happy sound he'd made since Marusir showed up. Even through his worry, Clay was pleased. "What are you doing?" Sunny's anxious voice echoed across the main hall. "What's that for?" The heavy tread of dragon footsteps reached their ears, along with an ominous clanking. "Stop! Wait! You don't have to do that!" There was an enormous splash. Clay raced into the big cave with Starflight close behind him. He skidded to a halt, horrified. Kestrel and Dune were standing on the bank of the river, holding a length of iron chain between their talons. Behind them, Marusir was holding Sunny back with his tail as the tiny golden dragon tried to climb over him. Webs emerged from the river, dragging a writhing, hissing ball of blue scales. Kestrel and Dune threw the chain around Tsunami's neck and wrapped it around one of her legs. The three guardians hauled her over to one of the rock columns that stretched from the floor to the ceiling high above. Dune flung the chain around the column twice, binding Tsunami with barely 3 steps to move in any direction. Kestrel took 2 ends of chain and blasted them with a bolt of flame. The metal melted into a bubbling mass, welded together. Tsunami was trapped. "Maybe some time away from the river will teach you to be grateful for what you have," Kestrel growled. It all happened so fast. Clay didn't have time to figure out what was happening, let alone stop it before it was too late. He let out a yell of dismay and charged across the cavern. "Let her go!" He grabbed the chain and let go at once, hissing with pain at the searing heat. "You'll regret this," Tsunami snarled. She clawed at the chain around her back leg, but pulling on it tightened the loop around her neck. With a hiss, she stopped struggling. "When we are free, when my family hears about this, when the rest of the world finds out how you treated the Dragonets of Destiny." "All your big dreams of your wonderful family," Kestrel mocked her. "They don't care about you. When it's time to fulfill the prophecy, you'll be alive, and the Talons of Peace will have you, and that's all that matters." "Why are you doing this?" Sunny cried. "Tsunami's the good one. She's wonderful. If anyone can save the world, it's her." "Actually, Tiny Sandwing," Marusir rumbled, "the dragonet you should believe in is Starflight over there." He nodded at Starflight, still rooted in place by the sleeping cave. Starflight ducked his head. "Nightwings are natural leaders. You do what he says, and you'll be all right." Clay glanced over at Starflight and saw Glory standing in the archway of her own sleeping cave. Marusir narrowed his eyes at her. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said to the Guardians, "to make sure that everything has been dealt with." "We understand," Kestrel said. Together she and Dune rolled the boulder aside. Marusir squeezed through the gap and disappeared into the blackness without a backward glance. "This is for your own good," Webb said, stopping in front of Tsunami. She raked her talons at him, and he stepped back. We only want to keep you safe. Maybe this isn't the perfect way, but... The dragonets don't know what's best for them, Dune said as the boulder thudded back into place. You need us, whether you like it or not. You are all awful today, Kestrel said. No dinner for any of you. Go to bed. And I don't want to hear a squawk out of anyone until morning. Really? What else are you going to do to me? Tsunami challenged her. What if I feel like singing all night? She started howling in her off-key voice. Oh, the dragonets are coming. They're coming to save the day. They're coming to fight, for they know what's right. The dragonets, hooray! Your fault, Dune snarled at Webbs. I told you not to teach them that horrible bar song. Oh, the dragonets are coming, Tsunami bellowed even louder. We have more chains, Kestrel yelled in her ear. We could throw one around your snout if you would like me to force you to be quiet. Tsunami paused, glaring at her mutinously, then took another breath in and opened her mouth. Or we could chain up one of your friends, Kestrel offered. Perhaps Clay would like to spend the night hanging from a stalactite, so you have some company out here. Clay shifted uneasily on his feet, wondering if there was anywhere he could hide out of Kestrel's reach before she could grab him. Tsunami snapped her jaws shut and lay down with her head turned away from all the dragons. Her gills fluttered furiously, but she kept quiet. Much better, Kestrel said. She stomped off to her tunnel, her red scales flaring brightly in the fire's reflection. Webbs followed her with his wet tail leaving a darker trail behind them. Sunny pounced on Dune's tail before he could go after them. Please don't leave her like this, she said. I know you're not that mean. Dune shook her off. We're doing what we have to. He went after the others. As soon as they were gone, Clay tried tugging on Tsunami's chains again. They were hopelessly strong. Clay, stop, Tsunami whispered. You know what you have to do. Go quickly. Clay shivered, dreading the cold water. But she was right. For the first time, spying on the Guardians was really important. He ran over to the river and dove in. Through the water, he could hear the muffled echo of Sunny's nervous squeak as he swam against the current to the rock wall. Without Tsunami's glow-in-the-dark scales to guide him, it took longer than usual to find the gap that led through to the other cave. But finally he felt open space under his claws, and he ducked and squeezed through. His heart was hammering in his chest as he popped through into the cave. Slowly, he paddled to the surface and poked his ears out into the air. This wasn't the loud confrontation they'd heard the previous night. This time, the 3 big dragons were huddled around the fire, whispering. None of them glanced at the river as Clay floated closer. When tomorrow? Webbs asked. Kestrel leaned toward the fire, baking her scales an even brighter red. He'll be back by midday. It has to be done by then. Her tail was coiled in a tight knot beside her. He doesn't want to see her again. Clay clenched his talons under the water. They had to be talking about glory. Well, I'm not doing it, Webbs said. Dune shot him a withering look. No one thought you would. Even though this is all your fault, said Kestrel. I still think we need 5 of them, Webbs snapped. What's he going to do about that? He'll find us a skywing, Kestrel said. Properly this time, no colorful substitutions. They all went quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. So, how and when? Dune said in his no-nonsense military voice. Drowning would be simplest. He glared at Webbs. I joined the Talons of Peace to stop killing dragons, Webbs said. I won't argue with Marusir, but I'm not doing it myself. It has to be me. Kestrel said in a choked, tense voice. She's just a rain wing, but she still might get away from you. She nodded at Dune's missing foot and the long scar that ran through his mangled wing. But can you go through with it? Webbs asked. Isn't it too much like... I mean, we all know what happened. That was totally different, Kestrel snapped. Glory is just a rain wing. I don't care about her. I don't even like her. She blasted a ball of flames at the fire so it blazed up. If you're sure, Webbs started. I'll do it tonight while she's sleeping, Kestrel said. I can get in there and break her neck before the others know what I'm doing, especially with the bossy one safely chained up. Tsunami's the only one who could stop me. Shudders of horror were running through Clay so violently that he was afraid one of the big dragons would notice the waves on the water. He began paddling softly backward, but froze when he heard his name. Not Clay? Dune asked. He might try at least. He'll definitely try, Webb said. Dumb as a rock, but he's devoted to the other four. It's not natural, that much loyalty in a dragon, Dune said. Especially to dragons outside your own tribe. I can handle him, Kestrel said. Even if he finally gets mad like we want him to, there's nothing he can do to stop me. Clay had heard enough. He sank down below the surface and swam toward the gap in the wall. What do we do? What can we do? What can I do? There's no time. How do I save her? Chapter 6. It's not true, Sunny said. They wouldn't. They definitely would, said Tsunami. They'll do anything if they think it's right for the prophecy. The dragonets all looked at Glory, whose scales had gone pale green. Even her usual aloof expression was gone. She paced around Tsunami's rock column, lashing her tail. But we won't let them, Clay blurted. He was still panting and dripping icy water on the stone floor. Right, Tsunami? We'll stop them. You don't have to get involved, said Glory. This is my problem, not yours. How will you stop them? Tsunami asked Clay, ignoring her. Even all of you together are no match for Kestrel, especially with Dune helping her, and I can't do anything. She bared her teeth and snapped at her chains, pulling the one around her neck dangerously tight. So we escape, Clay said, just like you wanted. We get you out of there and we escape tonight, right now. Escape? Sunny squeaked. Seriously, Glory said. Apple red stripes flickered across her ruff like lightning. You don't have to do anything. I'm the one that doesn't fit in. I'll fight her or figure something out. Of course we have to do something, Clay said fiercely. If escape were that easy, we'd have done it already, Starflight pointed out. He stepped around Glory, stood up on his back legs, and tapped on the boulder that blocked the entrance. This is the only way out, and they have it rigged on a mechanism that only the big dragons can move. They do? Clay said. Starflight nodded. You know how Dune never leaves because he can't fly? He has a stone that fits in this slot. He tapped a grooved niche in the stone wall. He turns it in here to unlock something, so they can roll the boulder from inside the cave. But when Kestrel or Webbs come from outside, there must be a lever or switch they use to open it from out there. Oh! Clay felt like an idiot for trying so hard to roll the big rock all these years. He'd never even noticed that Dune unlocked something before moving the boulder. He'd never thought twice about the oddly shaped stone that was always around the sand dragon's neck. So, can we steal Dune's rock? Sunny suggested. Terrible idea, Glory said immediately. They'd catch us for sure, Starflight said to Sunny more kindly. especially tonight, when they're already on high alert because of Morosir. Well, then what about the sky? Sunny asked. Is there any way to move the boulder without the rock? Tsunami interrupted her. Starflight shook his head. Only from the outside. It's impossible from in here. Believe me, I've thought about it. Maybe the sky, Sunny said. And we couldn't force it? Clay asked Starflight. Even if we all leaned on it really hard? Starflight shook his head as Glory said, This is all really sweet, guys, but you shouldn't get in trouble for me. Morosir likes the rest of you. Just let me handle myself. Stop that! Tsunami snapped at her. Acting like a martyr won't help right now. Glory bristled. I'm not acting like a martyr. I'm trying to make sure nobody gets killed for no reason. Besides you, Tsunami argued. It's fine if it's you getting killed for no reason. It just doesn't matter, Glory said. I'm not even in the prophecy, so who cares what happens to me? I swear I'm going to kill you myself, Tsunami growled. Glory, she's trying to say that we care, Clay interjected, in her usual gentle way. Guys, what about the sky hole? Sunny said in a rush, jumping into the brief pause in the conversation. In the study room, couldn't we fly up to it and squeeze out? Oh, Sunny, don't be ridiculous, Tsunami said. It's way too small, Starflight explained. We'd never fit, especially Clay. But maybe I might, Sunny said. I could climb out and then go around and open the boulder from the outside, like Starflight said, right? And I could let you all out. Clay brushed her wing and twined his tail around hers. Sunny hadn't even thought of escaping before today, and yet she was volunteering for the most dangerous part of it without any hesitation. It won't work, Starflight said. I'm sorry, Sunny. I've flown up to the hole when no one was around. Me too, said Tsunami. Me too, said Glory. Clay felt slow. He'd sat below the sky hole often enough, watching the stars or clouds or rain overhead, but he'd never flown up to it or tried to climb out. Apparently the other dragonets had thought about escape a lot more than he had. The hole is smaller than you think, Starflight said to Sunny. I can barely fit my head through it. It's not a way out. The Minders wouldn't have left it there if it was, Glory said. She stopped next to Tsunami, waves of dark green pulsing from her ears to her tail. They're too careful. There's no way to escape. There must be, Clay said desperately. He could feel time slipping away. Kestrel might come down to kill Glory at any moment. She wouldn't care if they all saw her do it. He could tell that Tsunami was thinking hard. She kept looking at him like she wanted to say something, then stopped herself. What if we tried talking to them? Sunny offered hesitantly. Maybe we could convince them to let her go instead. Glory snorted. Nobody else answered. Sunny sighed, pressing her wings back against her sides. You have an idea, Clay said to Tsunami. I can tell. You've been working on an escape plan forever. She wound her talons through the chains, hissing. It's too dangerous, she said. It was supposed to be me. He caught her sideways glance and followed her eyes to the river. The river. They'd only ever gone upstream, into the Guardian's cave. Downstream, the river flowed from the main cavern along the tunnel into the battle cave, and then Clay had no idea where it went. The roof of the battle cave sank lower and lower until the river disappeared. Clay had never explored underwater in the battle cave. He'd never wondered about where the river went. But of course, Tsunami had. Do you know where the river goes? He asked. No, I've seen the gap in the wall, but it's even smaller than the one to the Guardian's cave, she said. I've never been through in case I couldn't get back, but the river has to go somewhere. Can we get out that way? He asked. Not all of us, she said. Only me. And me, he said. She shook her head. Clay, you can't. We have no idea what's on the other side. You can only hold your breath for an hour. You could get trapped with no air and drown. And you can't see in the dark like me. You'd be swimming blind into who knows what. It has to be a sea wing who goes. It has to be me. And even if you did get out, Starflight said, how would you find us again? How would you get back to this cave from the outside? The sky hole, Clay said, pouncing on an idea of his own at last. You guys start a fire in the study room, and I'll follow the smoke back to you. Then I'll know the entrance is nearby, and once I find it, I can let you all out. Gloria's eyes glinted. I can think of a few scrolls I'd like to burn. Clay grinned at the shocked expression on Starflight's face. Yeah, me too, he said. Throw the slug-like qualities of Mudwings on there and think of me. Stop joking about this, Tsunami cried. Clay, you can't go, and that's final. You'll almost certainly die. But Glory will die if I don't, he said. Right? There's no other way. Tsunami growled and thrashed her whole body, straining against the chains. The heavy links pressed into the scales of her neck, and she stopped with a cough. Wait, you won't be able to see the smoke until daylight, Sunny said worriedly. Won't Kestrel come for Glory before then? Clay's hopes dropped like a boulder in his stomach. He hadn't thought of that. He might not make it back in time. It might all be for nothing. Then Glory smiled, and her scales shifted into a warm, rosy pink. I know what to do, she said. Starflight's method. Act like a lump and hope no one notices you? Tsunami said sarcastically. Hey, Starflight protested. Exactly, Glory said. She crouched down to the floor, slowly, as if the stone were eating her alive. Grays and browns and blacks crept over her scales. All her beautiful colors faded away. The shadows and crags behind her appeared perfectly reproduced, as if the dragonets were seeing right through her. She closed her eyes and vanished. Wow, Sunny said faintly. I mean, I knew you could, but I'd never. The Guardians don't know I can do this. They all jumped as Glory's voice came from the top of a stalagmite. I guess it's a good thing we never studied rain wings after all. I'll find a corner and hide. You don't even have to risk the river, Clay. I could just stay like this. For how long? Starflight said. Until you starve? Or one of them catches you accidentally? Tsunami was right earlier, Clay said. We do need to get out of here as soon as we can. Sunny gave Tsunami an unhappy look. Why didn't anybody tell me? She asked, but no one answered her. All right, said Glory with a sigh. Her green eyes appeared again, halfway across the cave. She was looking straight at Clay. Do what you want, as long as you're not doing it only for me. I'll stay out of the way until Clay comes back to get us. Clay felt like the rosy pink color was rising up through his scales now. Glory trusted him. She believed he could do this. He could save her. He could save all of them. He just had to survive the river first. Chapter 7. I hate this, Tsunami called softly. I hate this a lot. She beat her wings against the chains that trapped her. I don't love it either, said Glory's voice. Shh, Starflight scolded from the riverbank. Clay stood in the shallows, shivering as the icy water washed over his talons. He wished he could take fire with him underwater. He wished he knew what he was getting into. He really, really wished he didn't have to go alone. But he had to do this. He glanced at the corner of the cave where Glory had disappeared. Are we sure this is the only way? Sunny asked, splashing the river with her tail. I bet I could think of some more ideas with a little more time. We don't have any more time, Clay said. Follow the current, Starflight said to Clay. Don't leave the river. If it goes out into the world anywhere, the current should take you there. If, Clay thought. Stop and rest anytime you find a place to breathe, Starflight went on. If you can't find a place where the river surfaces, don't panic or you'll run out of air faster. Clay felt like he was panicking already when he thought about swimming into inky blackness with no idea if he'd ever breathe again. His whole body tightened with fear. He felt the brush of wingtips next to his and turned. The river eddied around the blurry outline of Glory beside him. Go hide, he whispered. Thank you, Clay, she said quietly. I'll never admit I said this, but I want you to know I would never have made it through the last 6 years without the 4 of you. Same here, Clay said. Growing up under the mountain without Glory, Sunny, Tsunami, and Starflight would have been too miserable to bear. Me too, Starflight said. Sunny nodded. She twined her tail in Glory's and touched one of Clay's talons. Good luck, said Glory. She stepped out of the river and melted back into the shadows. Be really, really careful, Clay, Tsunami said. Her chains were taut around her legs and neck as she leaned toward them. Come back if you have to. Don't keep going if it's too dangerous. Don't you dare die, Sunny added, flinging her forearms around his neck and beating his wings with hers. You all stay safe too, Clay said. He took a deep breath, then another. I'll be rolling away that boulder before you know it. He couldn't delay any longer. He nodded to his friends and dove into the river. Swimming helped warm him a little, but his scales still felt crusted with ice by the time he'd made it down the tunnel to the battle cave. He swam to the far wall, where the rock sloped down into the water. He floated for a moment, feeling the current tugging him. Then he inhaled and dove down. By the flickering light of the torches above, he could see the patch of wall that was darker than the rest. Tsunami was right. This hole was smaller than the gap to the Guardian's cave. Well, it was flatter, but wider too, more like a snarling dragon mouth, complete with sharp outcroppings like teeth. He couldn't see anything but darkness on the other side. Clay reached one forearm into the hole and felt nothing but emptiness. Dark water rushed past him. He arrowed to the surface and took the longest, deepest breath of his life, hoping it wouldn't be his last. The water closed over his head in an awful, final kind of way. He tried not to think about that. With a few swift kicks, he swam back to the hole and grabbed the rocks on either side to brace himself. He folded his wings tightly to his body and snaked his head through the hole. His shoulders followed, then his wings, scraping painfully against the stone teeth. His front talons found a lip of rock ahead of him, and he seized it, pulling himself forward. He felt his shoulders slip into open space just as his haunches got stuck. His back claws scrabbled for a grip. He tried to flatten himself to the rock, squishing himself sideways. He wriggled as hard as he could, remembering Starflight's instructions. Don't panic, don't panic, don't... He popped loose so suddenly that he spun forward, head over tail, and had to flail around with his wings to straighten himself out. As he did, he felt stone brushing his wingtips on either side. Cautiously, he reached out into the darkness. Rock pressed closely around him. The river was narrow here, and the current was strong. It carried him forward even when he wasn't trying to swim. Everything was pitch dark. He tried paddling up to find the surface of the river, but his head barked painfully against a rock ceiling. There was no air here, only a tight channel filled by the river. He wasn't even sure there was space to turn around if he wanted to go back. But I don't want to go back. I can't go back." Clay forced himself to swim, kicking his back legs and waving his wings as much as he could in the cramped space. Water gurgled in his ears, as if it were laughing at his efforts. His heartbeat seemed louder than he'd ever noticed before. He didn't know how long he swam through the dark, twisting channel, but after a while, his chest began to hurt. He had never actually tried holding his breath for an entire hour before. The dragonets only knew he could because that's what it said about mudwings in a couple of scrolls. What if it took practice? What if only full-grown mudwings could do it? What if his lungs were still too small? What if he drowned down here, alone, and his friends never knew what happened to him, and Kestrel killed Glory, and he really was the most useless dragonet in Pyria? I will not panic. Clay climbed toward the surface for the 100th time, setting his jaw stubbornly. Still, only solid rock above him. But it seemed like the rock was slanting upward. Was it? He reached his wings up to brush against the stone and swam faster. The channel was definitely getting wider. He couldn't feel the walls on either side of him anymore. Suddenly, the rock above him disappeared as well. The strength of the current dropped away. It felt as if he'd swum out into a wide-open pool. Clay beat his wings, rising up and up through the dark water, his tail lashing to drive him forward. He was deeper than he'd realized, far below the surface. But were those stars above him? He nearly sucked in a mouthful of water in excitement. Could he have made it outside already? Something was shining overhead. He could see small spots of light, like the night sky through the hole. His head burst out of the water. Clay yelped with glee as he breathed in and out, grateful for air like he never had been before. But his voice echoed back to him, bouncing off cave walls. This air didn't smell like the sky, and he couldn't hear anything beyond the stillness of rock and the fading echoes of his own cry. He floated on the surface of the pool. The current was still moving sluggishly somewhere below his talons. All was darkness around him, except for those points of light overhead. Glowworms. He was still under the mountain, in a cave full of thousands of glowworms. The eerie little insects pulsed with a greenish light. Glowing tendrils hung from several of them, like a shimmering star curtain far above him and around him in the pool's reflection. By their dim light, he could faintly see the distant arch of cave walls. He wasn't outside, but at least he was breathing. He followed Starflight's advice, resting for as long as he dared. It was so cold in the water that he couldn't feel the tip of his tail or the outer ridge of his wings. He tried breathing a spurt of fire up into the air, but his chest was too frozen to produce more than a flicker of flame. It was almost more than he could bear to make himself duck under the water again. But finally, he took another deep breath and dove. For a terrible moment, he was afraid he'd lost the current. He had no idea where he'd come in. He had no idea if the river even left this cave. What if this wide, silent pool was the end? Could he make it back to his friends, fighting that strong current the whole way? Then he realized that when he floated, there was something carrying him along. It was weaker, but the current was still there. He spread his wings wide and stretched his tail down, letting himself drift like a leaf until he was sure which direction it went. On the far side of the cave, in the dim light of the glowworms, he found a passageway where the river left the pool. The ceiling was still far above him. He could swim and breathe for a while longer. Clay beat his wings to push himself forward through the water. It was peaceful and creepy at the same time, with all those starworms glowing overhead like a million burning eyes. But it was much preferable to solid rock, complete darkness, and no air. After a while, the current started to pick up again. Clay's wings brushed against rocks jutting out of the river, and the glowworms were fewer and farther between. The darkness seemed to press down like Kestrel crushing him during battle training. And then he heard the roaring. Clay's ears pricked up. Was it dragons? His first thought was that he was hearing Kestrel roaring in fury as she discovered she had lost Glory and Clay, but he was too far away to hear anything like that. Then he started to worry. What would Kestrel do when she found Clay and Glory missing? Would she punish the others, especially Tsunami, all chained up and unable to fight back? He was so distracted worrying about his friends that it took him a while to notice that the roaring was getting louder. Suddenly he bashed into a boulder sticking out of the river. Reeling with pain, Clay spun in the water, flailing for a hold on something. He crashed into another rock, bounced off, and slammed into yet another. The river was going so fast now that he couldn't stop himself. He was being dragged toward the roaring at top speed. With a jarring shock, he hit a spur of stone and dug in with all his talons. The rushing water whipped past him, seizing his tail and his wings with icy, desperate fingers. Clay fought his way out of the river until finally he stood, gasping, on bare rock. He swept his tail around, trying to feel how big a rock he was standing on. It was big. It stretched farther than he could reach. He edged forward until he was sure he was standing on the bank of the river. A slope beside him rose away from the water. He could feel a small trickle of a stream bubbling down the slope, joining the river near his talons. Clay dropped his head, trying to think. Now that he was out of the water, the cold was penetratingly deep. It coiled and twisted around his bones. He coughed, hoping to summon a flame, but it was no use. Some dragons carried fire within them always. A skywing or a nightwing could blast flames any time. Sea wings and ice wings could never breathe fire, but others, like mudwings, needed the right conditions, warmth most of all. Remembering all his fire-breathing failures, Clay could hear Kestrel's scornful voice hissing about what a disappointment he was. Not this time, he thought. I will figure this out. He could guess what the roaring was, although he had never seen a waterfall, and he certainly didn't want to experience one for the first time in total darkness. Even if he could fly over it, without his sight, he'd be sure to run into something and crash. But he couldn't leave the river. Could he? Clay set one claw in the trickling stream and was surprised to find it was a little warmer than the river. Where did it come from? Up? Surely up meant closer to the surface and the outside world. He inhaled, hoping to catch the scent of the outside, but the only faint smell was of rotten eggs. He set his jaw. The stream had to lead somewhere not over a waterfall. Clay spread his wings to feel the cave walls and crept up the stream, slipping now and then on the slick stone. Soon he felt a ledge ahead of him. He climbed over it and splashed into a deeper pool. The rotten egg smell was much stronger up here. He tried to wade forward, and the water crept up his legs. Suddenly he felt a stinging pain slice through the softer scales of his underbelly. With a hiss, he scrambled back up on the ledge. His wings caught on something sticky overhead, and he felt the same sharp pain shivering through his tendons. He pulled his wings in close to his body quickly, but the stickiness came with it and suckered onto his scales like enormous globby leeches. It felt like the poison in Dune's tail stabbing him in 1,000 places, dissolving his skin from the inside out. Clay let out an agonized yell and tried to stumble back down the slope to the river, but he'd lost the feel of the stream under his claws. He was stumbling blind over bare rocks. Frantic to escape the pain, he lunged toward the sound of the waterfall. His head collided with something hard that knocked him to the cave floor. As he lost consciousness, his last thought was, I failed them. Chapter 8. Freezing water splashed over Clay's head. He woke up with a gasp as the rest of his body was plunged into the river. Strong talons gripped his shoulders, shoving him under the water. He thrashed, terrified, and the current nearly dragged him away. The other dragon yanked his head into the air and shouted, Quit struggling! I'm saving you! Clay went limp and let himself be shoved under again. He felt the sticky poison washing from his scales. although the pain lingered. As his panic died down, memory clicked on. He lunged back to the surface. "Tsunami!" he yelped. He tried to wrap his wings around her, flapping and splashing in the dark. Her claws dug into the spines along his back. "Seriously, Clay, stop moving!" She whacked his tail back into the water with her own. "I don't know what this white stuff is, but it smells awful, and I think it's trying to dissolve your scales. You stay in the water until it's all gone." She moved his claws to the rock and helped him hang on against the fierce current while she poured more water over his head. He strained his eyes, trying to see her, or even a black shadow that might be her, but it was too dark. He clung to the feeling of her cold, wet scales against his. She was really here. "How did you get free?" he asked through chattering teeth. They had to shout to be heard over the roaring waterfall. "Fire," Tsunami said. "I realized if Kestrel's flames could merge the chains together, maybe more fire would break them apart. She knew I couldn't do it, and as usual she figured we wouldn't help each other, because that's not dragon nature or whatever. It took Sunny and Starflight together to get their fire hot enough, but they blasted one of the links until it melted, and then I followed you as fast as I could." Clay rested his head on the rock by her talons. It felt like the cracks between his scales were singing high-pitched arias of pain. "Well," he said, "as you can see, it's going great so far. I was just about to save the day." "You would have," Tsunami said. "I'm sure you would have woken up soon and made it to the river on your own." She batted one of his wings lightly with hers. Clay wasn't sure of that at all, but he wasn't about to add whining to the list of things wrong with him. "Did you see the glowworms?" he asked instead. "Kind of cool, right?" "Oh, I can beat that." A moment passed, and then Tsunami's stripes began to glow along her wings and tail. She even turned on the whorls of light along her snout. Dimly, the cave took shape around them. Clay had never been so happy to see anything in his life. "Thanks," he said. "It seems kind of unfair. You guys can see in the dark. It's the rest of us who actually need glowing scales." Tsunami ducked her head in an odd, embarrassed way. "Well, they're not meant to help us see," she said. Clay stretched his legs and tail under the water. The goop on his scales was gone, but the stinging was still there, battling the freezing numbness caused by the river. "Really?" he said, trying to take his mind off the pain. "Then why do you glow?" Well... He'd never seen Tsunami stammer over anything. Now he was really curious. "Tell," he said, splashing her. "You know, you're doing that thing you do," she said, "where you talk about something ridiculous so you don't have to deal with something serious." "Am not," Clay protested. "You're the one who's ducking the question." "All right, fine," she said with a grimace. "Glowing in the dark. Webb says it's to attract other sea wings. That's how we choose our partners, or whatever." She shoved his head under the water again, and he came up sputtering. "Now, aren't you sorry you asked?" He was, a little bit. The idea of Tsunami leaving them for another sea wing with cool glowing scales made Clay feel extra blobby and drab. "So, we can't go up the rocks," he said. "What do we do about the waterfall?" He hoped she wouldn't ask whether his scales still hurt. He just had to tough it out until the pain went away. She grinned. "We dive right over it," she said. "How high could it be?" "And how many sharp rocks could there be at the bottom?" he countered. "I'd like to see what we're jumping off first, please." "All right, let's go check it out," she said, releasing him and leaping into the water. The current whooshed her away, and he had to let go of his rock to follow her quickly before the light of her scales disappeared. "Tsunami!" he called. There was no way she could hear him over the roaring waterfall. An underwater boulder slammed into his belly, and he inhaled a mouthful of river. Choking and coughing, he paddled after the blurry glow in the distance. Suddenly, the glow vanished, and he was plunged into darkness again. "Tsunami!" he roared. A heartbeat later, Clay felt the air suddenly yawn wide in front of him. Some instinct kicked in, and he lashed out with his talons and tail. One of his claws caught a jagged spur of rock, and he flung his front talons around it just as the rest of him flew out into space. He was dangling over the waterfall. He dug his claws into the rock and hung on for dear life, scrunching his eyes shut, even though the darkness was dark enough. His poison-riddled skin screamed with agony as it stretched below his scales. He couldn't bear to think of how far Tsunami might have fallen. He could picture her broken body, somewhere far below him. Something whacked his foot. "Watch out, Clay," Tsunami's voice teased. "It's really dangerous. You might stub a claw." Clay opened his eyes. The waterfall crashed along beside him, cascading into a foamy pile of bubbles only a short distance below his dangling back claws. Tsunami was splashing and somersaulting in the pool, flipping waves at him with her tail. "Hang on tight," she cried. "Whatever you do, don't let go." "Ha, ha, ha," he said. He stirred the water below him with his tail, checking for rocks, then let himself drop. The waterfall gently battered his head as he resurfaced. "You knew how short it was," he said accusingly. "Maybe," she said with a grin. "All right, yes. I just got to the edge when I heard you yell and went back for you." "Lucky I'm not the type to suffer and die in silence," Clay said. But he couldn't help thinking, what would have happened if I hadn't cried out? What if we had missed each other? "Come on, the river keeps going this way," Tsunami said. Her webbed feet swooped through the water, shooting her out in front of him. He followed her through the pool into another narrow channel, with rocky banks on either side. "But," he cocked his head, his ears twitched. "I think that can't be all the roaring then. Is there more up ahead?" There were weird echoes in these caves. He couldn't tell if he was hearing the roar of the small waterfall magnified, or if there was something else. Tsunami suddenly spread her wings and spun to a halt, gazing up at the ceiling. "Did you see that?" Clay squinted into the darkness. Her luminescent scales didn't cast light very far. He couldn't even see the stalactites that were probably up there. "No." "It was a bat!" Tsunami excitedly slammed the river with her tail, submerging Clay in a tidal wave of water. He came up, gasping for air. "A bat? Why are we drowning me over a bat?" Once a bat had blundered in through the sky-hole. It had flapped pathetically around the study cave until Sunny begged Dune to catch it and set it free. Clay was half convinced that Dune had eaten it instead, but at least he'd done it where Sunny couldn't see him. "Because it must have come from somewhere," she said. "Bats go outside to hunt. So if bats can get in and out, I bet we can too. We must be close." "Bats are a lot smaller than we are," Clay pointed out, but Tsunami had already started swimming. He flexed his wings under the water, worried. The pain wasn't going away. It felt like tiny, sharp teeth biting him all over under his scales. "Look!" Tsunami yelled from up ahead. "I see light!" Clay beat his wings quickly, trying to catch up. It helped that the current was getting faster again. But then, was the roaring getting louder too? He came around a bend in the river and saw a circle of silvery light in the distance. The dark outline of Tsunami's head was barreling toward it. Clay couldn't believe his eyes. It was moonlight. Just like he'd seen through the sky hole. There really was a way out, and they'd found it. He was speeding along now, barely using his legs to paddle as the river whisked him toward the light. Suddenly, a piercing shriek echoed through the cave, and Tsunami disappeared. "Please be another joke. Please be another joke," Clay prayed, swimming as fast as he could. The moonlit entrance yawned wide in front of him, and then, abruptly, he shot out into open space. The river plunged out of the cave and straight down a tall, sheer cliff. Clay's wings flew open and he banked, catching the air before he fell. He was flying! Yawned wide in front of him, and then, abruptly, he shot out into open space. Chapter 9. Clay had flown before. Short hops around the caves, dodging the stalactites and flapping in circles. But that was nothing. Nothing compared to this. Everything was so big. The sky was everywhere. It just went on and on and on like nothing could ever fill it up. It was night, but the light of the 3 moons was dazzling after a lifetime of caves and sputtering torches. Craggy mountain peaks bit into the sky all around him. In the distance, he thought he saw a glimmer of sea. And the stars. Clay had thought he knew stars from gazing out of the sky hole. He'd never known how many there were, or how they looked like a silver net cast across the dark. He felt like he could keep flying up and up forever, all the way to the moons. He wondered if any dragon had ever tried to do that. This is what we've been missing all this time. Even the sharp lines of pain between his scales couldn't take away his excitement. "Can you believe this?" he called, spinning in the air. "Tsunami, isn't it amazing?" There was no answer. Clay lashed his tail to stop spinning and hovered, his eyes darting around the sky. He couldn't see Tsunami anywhere. She wouldn't have flown off without him, would she? Maybe she'd seen the faraway sea. Maybe she saw her home and couldn't resist. Clay knew she wouldn't abandon her friends, but he also knew how desperately she wanted to return to the ocean. He glanced down toward the horizon and spotted her, far below him, flapping in a frantic downward spiral. Something was wrong. It looked like only one of her wings was working. Clay twisted into a dive and barreled toward her. He tucked his wings close to his body, fighting back the terror as he plummeted. Wind whistled past his face. Wind! He'd imagined it all wrong. It was like a live thing, grabbing his tail to throw him off balance, whisking in his eyes to blind him, flaring under his wings to slow him down. It seemed to dig icicle-sharp claws into his skin, slicing under his scales. The waterfall and the cliff shot past at lightning speed. Was he falling too fast? The ground hurtled toward him, shadows and moonlight mixed in shapes he'd never seen and couldn't understand. He had no idea how far away it was, or how soon he would reach it. He'd never dealt with distances like this before. Would he be able to stop? Would it hurt when he did? But he could see Tsunami below him, still struggling, so he knew that she hadn't hit the bottom yet, and that made him braver. He fell, and fell, and fell, and she got closer and closer until... Clay passed her and instantly flared his wings open. His body slammed upright like he'd run into a wall, and then a moment later, he was whammed again, this time by a heavy sea wing landing on him from above. He tumbled, nearly losing Tsunami over his head, but they caught onto each other with their talons and held tight. With her claws wrapped fiercely around his neck, Clay battled to stay aloft, beating his wings in wide arcs. He wasn't strong enough to lift her, but at least he could slow her fall. Tsunami let out a yelp, and then Clay felt something like claws snag his wings and tail. They lost their hold on each other as they fell through the trees, smashing branches and ripping off leaves before they thudded to earth. It took Clay a moment before he could breathe again. Tsunami's tail was flopped across his snout. He pushed it aside and sat up, creaking with pain. Tsunami rolled over onto her back, letting her wings flop out to either side. Close up, Clay could see that he was right. One of her azure blue wings was crooked, as if it had been wrenched out of her shoulder. He touched it with one claw, and they both winced. "What happened?" Clay asked. "Getting out of the chains," Tsunami said. "I think I dislocated it." "And you came after me anyway?" Clay said, appalled. "Why didn't you tell me you were hurt?" She shrugged and winced again. "It didn't hurt so much in the river, but once I tried to fly." "Dirt!" Clay yelled suddenly. "I'm standing on dirt!" He stabbed his claws into the ground and they sank right into the earth. A thrill ran through him from snout to tail. Tsunami sat up to look at him. "Yay?" she said. "It's amazing!" he cried. "Feel how soft it is!" He seized a handful of dirt and flung it at her. "Hey, quit that!" she protested, defending herself with her good wing. Clay flattened himself to the grass, feeling the warm earth crumble around his legs and clump against his scales. Scents of green and brown and buried sunshine overwhelmed him. It was nothing like the hard, cold, bare rock under the mountain. The ground here was welcoming and full of life. A worm burrowed past his nose, and he snapped it up. "Well, now we're even," Tsunami said. "I saved you, you saved—" "I hear the river!" Clay cried, jumping up and shaking himself. Tsunami ducked the shower of dirt that flew off him. "River plus dirt means mud!" He spun around and raced through the trees toward the sound of bubbling water. Tsunami found him rolling blissfully in the muddy banks of the river. "I don't think most dragons get this excited about being so dirty," she said wryly. "I bet my kind do," Clay said, ignoring her sarcasm. "I've never been this warm in my whole life." For the first time ever, his claws didn't ache. His scales didn't itch. His wings didn't feel too dry. And he wasn't worried about stubbing his talons every other step. He felt the mud squelch into the gaps between his scales and realized that the pain from the cave poison was fading, as if the mud was healing him. He sighed happily, squishing himself farther down into the damp riverbank. "Wow," Tsunami said. She stuck her front talons in the river. "And we're not even at the mudwing swamps yet. I wonder if I'll be this excited when I get to the sea." "You will," Clay said, suddenly feeling certain and brave and confident. "And when you can fly, can we fix your wing?" He tilted his head, studying her injury. The waterfall poured down a cliff that towered over them, with even higher mountains beyond. The 3 moons were low in the sky. Clay guessed it would be morning soon, and then they could look for the smoke signal that would lead to their friends. But Tsunami couldn't fly. She'd be stuck down here. Easy pickings for any hostile dragons flying by. Clay glanced up at the sky, remembering that they'd popped out into a world at war. It seemed so peaceful here. From the way the big dragons talked, he'd imagined the entire world as a giant battlefield. It was strange to be in a quiet clearing, with no sights or sounds of war, or even other dragons anywhere nearby. But he knew that the Talons of Peace, and by extension the dragonets, had enemies everywhere. The 3 Sandwing Queens distrusted the prophecy and would kill anyone who got in their way. And there was a whole list of dragons who might do terrible things to the dragonets of destiny, if they ever found them. Tsunami twisted to look at her dislocated wing. "I'm sure I can fix it," she said. "I saw this in a scroll once. It just needs to be banged back into place. Maybe if I run myself into a tree." She glanced around at the forest, then suddenly charged at the nearest solid tree trunk. Clay leaped out of the mud and pounced on her tail, yanking her back before she crashed. "Ow!" Tsunami stormed. "Get off! I can fix it! This will work!" She snapped her teeth at him. "Stop being a grumpy skywing," Smashing yourself into a tree is a terrible plan, Clay said. Can I look at it? Tsunami settled down on the grass, grumbling, with her wings spread out. Clay circled her, then stood back and looked at the uneven line of her wings and shoulders. If you can stay still, he said, I think I can shove it back into place. Is that a good idea? Tsunami asked, flinching away from him. Better than running into a tree, he pointed out. Dig your claws in and brace yourself. Tsunami clutched the ground and closed her eyes. Clay felt gently along her shoulder with his front talons. It was easy to find the spot where a bone had slipped out of its socket. He touched it lightly until he was sure where it was and where it needed to be. Then he grabbed and shoved the bone into place in one quick, strong movement. Ow! Tsunami roared, rearing back. Her powerful tail whipped around and slammed Clay into a thicket of prickly bushes. I'm sorry! Clay yelped, floundering free. I really thought that would work. He stopped. Tsunami was turning in a circle, flexing and extending both wings. They looked perfectly matched again. It did work, she said. It's a little sore, but I can move it now. Pretty fierce, Clay. She helped disentangle his tail from the branches. Sorry I whacked you. Clay opened his mouth to respond, but Tsunami suddenly seized his snout and held it shut. She raised one talon, her ears twitching. What's that? She whispered. Clay tried to swivel his head around, but Tsunami's grip was too tight. He strained his ears to listen. Something was crashing through the forest toward them. Chapter 10. Not big enough to be a dragon, Tsunami whispered. I think. Now Clay could hear a huffing, panting sound and the cracking of branches. It sounded more prey than predator. He pried Tsunami's claws off his snout and whispered, Maybe we can eat it. They couldn't rescue the other dragonets until sunrise anyway, and he wanted to test his hunting skills outside the caves. A short, pale creature stumbled into the moonlit clearing in front of them. The top of its furry head was barely as high as Clay's shoulder. It had 2 long, thin legs and 2 dangling arms that ended in floppy, clawless talons. One arm held something pointy, like a giant dragon's claw, and the other was wrapped around a bulky sack. It spotted Tsunami and Clay, dropped everything it was holding, and shrieked a long, high-pitched note like the birds Clay had sometimes heard through the sky-hole. It's a scavenger! Tsunami cried with delight. Look, Clay, our first time outside and we're already seeing a real live scavenger. It's so little, Clay said. And look, it's scavenging something right now. He reached out to poke the bulky sack. The creature screamed again, backing away and covering its head with its arms. I thought they'd be scarier, Tsunami said, disappointed. She lowered her snout to peer at it. One of these killed Queen Oasis? Really? She picked up the metal claw it had been carrying, which was about 4 times as long as a regular dragon claw. I guess these are pretty sharp, but still. It must have been some kind of unlucky accident. Can we eat it? Clay asked, his tongue flicked out and in. Starflight says they're endangered, Tsunami said. But I say it's their fault we're all in this war, so eat as many as you like. She swung the claw in a circle and glared down at the scavenger. The scavenger was gibbering strange noises at them, waving its arms at the sack and the claw. Some of its movements were almost dragon-like, as if it was trying to communicate with them. Maybe it wants us to have whatever's in here, Clay said, lifting the sack. He upended it, and a pile of jewels and trinkets tumbled out, bouncing and sparkling across the grass. Clay saw 3 large rubies and a scattering of white diamonds among the gold shapes. Treasure! Tsunami cried. She picked up a silver medallion with a spiral carved into it, studded with tiny sapphires. "Glory would love that," Clay said. "So would I," Tsunami said. "I know you like bringing her pretty things to cheer her up, but I saw this first." "All right," Clay said diplomatically. "Maybe something else then. Can we keep all this treasure?" "Certainly not," said a new voice. "Not unless you want to fight me for it, which I don't advise." An orange skywing dragon, slightly bigger than Clay, landed soundlessly in the clearing behind the scavenger. Wreaths of smoke coiled around her horns. As the scavenger shrieked again, she bent down and bit off its head. "Blech!" she said, spitting it out again immediately. The head bounced across the grass as the body slowly toppled over, blood pouring out of its neck. "Now that's just unfair," said the orange dragon. "First of all, thieves are always trying to steal my beautiful treasure. And then, they aren't even delicious when I catch them." She poked the body. "All stringy and tasting like fish. Yuck." Clay took a step back from the spreading pool of blood. He didn't feel hungry anymore. "Who are you?" Tsunami asked. She was turning the medallion over between her claws, as if she wondered whether it might be worth fighting for. The orange dragon stared at her, her yellow eyes narrowing to slits. Clay noticed that a fine coat of golden chainmail, hung with rubies and amber drops, was fitted around the dragon's torso. A row of tiny rubies was embedded between the scales over each of her eyes, and more rubies edged the top of her wings. Whoever she was, she had a lot of treasure, which meant she must be important. "You don't know who I am," the strange dragon said. "How upsetting. I'm really very hurt. Either I need to get out more, or you're not a very good spy. Are you, Seawing?" "I'm not a spy," Tsunami said. "We don't even know where we are. We've been held prisoner, kind of, and we just escaped." The orange dragon tilted her head at Clay. "A sea wing and a mud wing together," she said. "Let's see. I know you're not from my dungeons unless I'm getting horribly forgetful. So who was holding you? Blaze? I don't think she has prison camps. Wouldn't fit with her everybody love me act." Clay took another step back. He didn't like the sound of a dragon who had her own dungeons. "Tsunami?" he said quietly. "Just give her back her treasure and let's go." "A mudwing using his head," said the orange dragon. "You don't see that very often." She slid menacingly towards Tsunami, stepping right through the scavenger's blood and leaving red claw prints on the grass. Small flames flickered in her nostrils, and a steady stream of white smoke poured out and gathered more thickly around her horns. "All right," Tsunami said, holding out the medallion. "We don't want any trouble." "Oh, neither do I," said the orange dragon. "That's why it makes me so sad when trouble keeps coming to me." She reached out and grabbed Tsunami's talon with the medallion still in it, squeezing hard. Clay started forward, but the strange dragon shot a bolt of flame at him, so he had to duck back. She glared at Tsunami. "Nobody touches my treasure." "We didn't know," Tsunami protested. "We don't even know who you are." "Oh," the dragon hissed. "Didn't I say? My name is Scarlet, but I highly recommend you call me Your Majesty if you want to live." Clay inhaled sharply. Even he recognized that name. They were standing face to face with the Queen of the Skywings. Chapter 11. She was smaller than he had expected, smaller than Kestrel. But Clay knew they shouldn't underestimate the Skywing Queen. She'd held on to her power for 30 years, despite 14 brave, foolish, extremely dead now challengers. She was one of the longest-lived and deadliest queens in Pyria. Not to mention one of the worst possible dragons to get her claws on the dragonets of destiny, especially since she was allied with Byrne, who hated the prophecy and had destroyed the Skywing eggs 6 years ago. Clay tried to remember anything else they learned about Scarlet. All he could think was, scary. Queen Scarlet let go of Tsunami's talons and slipped the medallion over her own neck. She turned and ran one claw down Clay's snout. Now you, Mudwing, make me curious. We're on the same side, so why didn't you recognize me? Like I said, Tsunami started. Queen Scarlet silenced her with a flick of her tail. I like to hear the Mudwing speak, she said, all rumbly and deep and nervous. Clay stammered. We've been underground a while. Kind of always. Tsunami made a face at him behind the Queen's back, which he guessed meant he shouldn't give too much away. But what was he supposed to say? He glanced up at the mountains looming overhead and realized that they were outlined with a golden glow. The sun was coming up. They needed to go rescue their friends, and fast, before Kestrel took out her anger on the dragonets she could find. We're just passing through, he said to Queen Scarlet. The rows of rubies over the Queen's eyes arched disbelievingly. I mean, it was an honor to meet, it was very terrifying, was the only word he could think of. We have to go, he blurted. Already, said the Queen. But that's heartbreaking. I hate being abandoned mid-conversation. There's so much more I want to know about you. She brushed the tip of her claw along the bottom of Clay's chin. I think the only place you should go is back to my palace in the sky. Doesn't that sound thrilling? Don't say no. It'll hurt my feelings. You're just what I've been looking for. Clay had no idea what that meant, but he was too petrified to respond anyway. He stared up into her unfriendly amber eyes, thinking for the first time in his life that maybe Kestrel was right about everything, most especially about staying under the mountain and avoiding all the bad dragons out in the world. Behind Scarlet, Tsunami raised the scavenger's sharp claw. Her eyes met Clay's. He felt the same chilling fear she must be feeling. If they attacked the Skywing Queen, they'd instantly have a new, powerful enemy who hated them. But they couldn't tell her the truth about themselves. She'd take them captive, or sell them to her ally Byrne, or kill them just to mess with the prophecy, and they couldn't go with her either. They had to get back to their friends. He nodded slightly. Do it. We have no choice. Tsunami stabbed the claw through Queen Scarlet's tail at the vulnerable spot, driving it straight into the ground beneath. The Queen roared with fury and pain. She whipped her head around and blasted fire in all directions. Fly! Tsunami yelled. She rolled under the flames and shoved Clay's tail. He spread his wings and bolted into the sky with Queen Scarlet's fire scorching his claws. Tsunami flapped beside him, her wing beats wobbly but determined. It won't take her long to get free, Tsunami called. Quick, we have to lose her in the peaks. She soared up the cliff, and Clay followed. They flew past the top of the waterfall, where the river flowed out of a hole in the cliff. They flew up and up until they reached the top and whooshed out onto a rocky plateau studded with dark green trees and bushes. Even up here, the mountains loomed over them, impossibly high and unbearably big. The peaks zigzagged to the north and south like crooked dragon teeth, a jagged row that went on and on and on. The bigness of everything kept overwhelming Clay. How would they ever find their friends again in all of this? And even if they did, what could 5 dragonets do to save a world this big? Tsunami led the way, staying low and swooping around trees, diving into chasms where they found them. Her wing beats were getting stronger as she flew. Sunlight spread across the mountains, dazzling Clay's eyes. He wasn't used to so much brightness. And this was only dawn. The ferocity of the midday sun was still ahead. "Here!" Tsunami called, jerking her head toward a dent in the side of the mountain. They spiraled down to land on the ledge outside a small cave. From here, they could look over the rocky plateau, with valleys and mountain peaks spread out around them. Clay peered down nervously. The roar of the waterfall was a faint rumble in the distance. There was no sign of Queen Scarlet. "I can't believe you did that," he said to Tsunami. "I had to, didn't I?" she asked, but without her usual conviction. She scratched at her gills, looking worried, then slipped into the shadows of the cave to check that it was empty. Clay wanted to reassure her, but he was worried too. He closed his eyes and turned his face toward the rising sun. The heat soaked down through his scales until even his bones felt warm at last. "You should see yourself," Tsunami said from the cave. "You're practically glowing. I didn't know mudwings had so many colors in them." Clay opened his eyes and glanced down. He'd always thought of himself as just brown. Plain brown scales, ordinary brown claws, the color of flat mud from horns to tail. But now, in the full sunlight for the first time, he could see gold and amber glints between and beneath his scales. Even the brown seemed richer and deeper, like the mahogany trunk where Webbs kept the most delicate scrolls. "Huh," he said. "You're so pretty," Tsunami joked, emerging into the light. Clay had to bite back a gasp. While the sun brought out his colors, it made her look bejeweled, like a dragon made of sapphires and emeralds, or summer leaves and oceans. He thought of Glory, and how beautiful she already was in the gloomy caves. None of them would be able to look at her in full sunlight, or else they'd be too dazzled to ever speak to her again. Glory. Clay squinted out at the mountainside. There were crags and holes and rocky outcroppings that might lead to tunnels everywhere. He had no idea what the outside of their home looked like. They could see a lot of the mountain from here, but no smoke signal yet. The sun had nearly cleared the horizon now, climbing slowly up the sky and chasing away the 3 moons. Clay saw several red shapes flitting around the distant mountain peaks. At first, he thought they were birds, until he spotted fire flickering around them like lightning and realized they were dragons. This was definitely Skywing territory. Starflight was right about where their secret cave was, but Clay had no idea how they'd escaped the mountains now that the Tsunami seized his shoulder. "Over there!" she cried, pointing. A thin column of smoke was starting to rise from a hole partway down the slope. Clay flung himself into the air and swooped over the hole. It was enclosed and partly hidden by a thicket of branches, so he couldn't land next to it. But it was open to the sky and looked like the shape of the sky hole to him. It had to be his friends. Tsunami swept up beside him. They both hovered around the smoke, trying to peer down into the hole. "Starflight and Sunny must be right there," Clay said. "Right below us!" The smoke smelled of old paper. He felt a twinge of pity for Starflight, burning some of his beloved scrolls. "So we're close, but we have to find the entrance," Tsunami said. "The tunnel must come out somewhere nearby." She spiraled down to the rocky ground outside the bushes. She started pacing as if she were trying to count off the distance from the study room to the entrance tunnel. Clay stayed up in the air, circling. He had the same funny feeling he'd had looking at Tsunami's crooked wing, that if he relaxed and just looked, he could see how things should fit together. He'd walked the caves under the mountain 1,000,000 times. He knew them better than his own claws. He could still hear the faint roar of the waterfall, so he could guess which way the underground river flowed. He pictured the tunnel from the study cave to the central hall and mapped it out on the craggy rocks below. "Here," he called to Tsunami, swooping down to land. "The boulder blocking the exit should be right below here, so the tunnel to the outside would go that way." He turned to look. "The ravine," Tsunami said. A crevasse cut through the rocks a short distance away. When they peered down into it, they could see a stream running over pebbly gravel and sandy mud. "The entrance must be down there somewhere." Clay hopped down to the bottom of the ravine, keeping his wings spread to slow his fall. Mud squelched between his talons as he landed. He felt a wave of anger wash over him. Here was mud and sunlight and warm, fresh air this close to their cave. Why hadn't the Guardians ever brought the dragonets outside? Even small trips to this ravine would have made life so different. He knew they'd say it was for safety. They'd say it was to protect the dragonets in case the distant skywing spotted them. But Clay guessed it was really because the Guardians didn't trust him and his friends. They didn't trust them not to fly away. They didn't trust them to act smart and avoid drawing attention to themselves. He dug sharp gashes in the mud with his claws. The dragonets never even had a chance to be trustworthy. Maybe Clay didn't deserve it, after attacking the others at hatching. Maybe the Guardians thought that something inside him might snap at any moment. But there was no reason to have kept Sunny and Glory and Starflight and Tsunami in the dark all these years. Tsunami thumped down beside him and nodded at a mossy pile of boulders up ahead. "Let's check there first." They squished and splashed down the stream. Clay spotted something in the mud in front of them. He flared his wings up to stop Tsunami from going any further. "Look," he said. "Dragon tracks." Fresh dragon prints were stamped into the riverbank, with a deep line of a tail dragged between them. They disappeared suddenly, as if the dragon had lifted off into the sky. Clay gingerly fit one of his own feet into a print. It was dwarfed by the size of the other dragon's talons. "If it came from our cave," Tsunami said, "and I'm sure it did, then it must be Kestrel." "How do you know?" Clay asked. Tsunami put her own foot down next to one of the prints. "No webs between the claws," she said. "So it's not a sea wing. They're too recent to be Morrowseers from yesterday, and you can see all 4 feet here, so it's not Dune." "Oh," Clay said, feeling foolish. "Of course." "There are prints leaving, but not coming back," Tsunami said, her voice rising with excitement. "Maybe she went out looking for us this morning. If she's still away, this is our best chance to get the others out." She started running down the riverbank, following the line of prints to where it began. "Come on, Clay, hurry!" Clay raced after her. The tracks led right to the tumble of boulders. When they climbed up onto the large rocks, they could see down into a dark tunnel in the side of the ravine. It was almost entirely hidden from view unless you looked from the right angle. "This is it," Tsunami whispered. Why didn't she hide her tracks better? Clay worried. What if it's a trap? It's not, Tsunami said confidently. Kestrel doesn't know we're coming back for the others. She doesn't think like that. If she were one of us, she'd escape and leave everyone else behind without a second thought. That sounded true to Clay. Kestrel never believed that dragons could keep their word or care about other dragons. She was in a hurry to find us, that's all, Tsunami pointed out. Clay glanced up at the sky anxiously. If Kestrel hadn't bothered to be cautious, she must be really angry with them. Tsunami lowered herself into the tunnel, and Clay slid down beside her. He was warm enough now to make fire, so he breathed a small burst of flame to give them a glimpse of the tunnel ahead. They edged forward as Tsunami's scales began to glow. The tunnel took a sharp right, then a left, then went down at a steep angle for a few steps, but soon it straightened out, took them around another corner, and ended at an enormous gray boulder. Clay's heart thumped hard in his chest. They'd really found it. He was looking at his prison from the outside. Chapter 12. Tsunami reared up on her back legs and began running her talons along the walls. "Look for something that'll move the boulder," she said. Clay breathed another burst of fire at the wall on his side. It looked like ordinary flat stone with a few fissures running from the ceiling to the floor. He scraped his claws through the cracks. Nothing happened, except his claws tingled painfully. He tried sniffing around the boulder, then shoved it, but it wouldn't move any more than it had on the other side. "I hope Starflight's right," he said, pushing away the sinking feeling in his stomach. "I hope we really can open it from this side." "We can," Tsunami said fiercely. "It'll be a lever or something." She backed away a few steps, peering up at the top of the boulder. "Or magic," Clay said. "What if it's a magic word, or some kind of talisman we don't have?" Tsunami stared at the boulder for a moment, frowning, then shook her head. "They'd need an animus dragon to enchant it, and who even knows if those ever existed in the first place?" The only thing Clay remembered about the lesson on magic and animus dragons was that they had power over objects. He remembered that because Starflight spent the rest of the day sticking his nose in the air and insisting that Nightwings were far more magically powerful than any mythical animus dragons. If they're so great, why do the Nightwings live somewhere mysterious where no one can find them? Clay had asked. "Easy," Starflight had said loftily. "It's because we have all these special powers, and we don't want to make regular dragons feel inferior." Even though they are, his expression implied. Clay snorted. "Special powers like what?" he'd asked. "You know," Starflight had answered, irritated. "Telepathy, precognition, invisibility, hello?" "You don't have invisibility," Clay had argued. "I mean, you're a black dragon. You're just hard to see in the shadows. That's not a power. I'd be invisible too if I were lying in a mud puddle." "Yeah, well," Starflight had said, "we can appear out of nowhere in the dark of night, swooping down as if the sky had just fallen on you." He'd spread his wings majestically. "Still not a power," Clay had said. "That's just you guys being creepy." "It is not creepy!" Starflight had cried, his voice rising. "It is magnificent and imposing!" He'd stopped and taken a deep breath. "Besides, we're the only ones with visions of the future, so there." "Well, I say until the Nightwings come down off the clouds, all we have is rumors and a mumbo-jumbo prophecy that could mean anything." Then Clay had draped his nose off the rim of the ledge and peered across at Starflight. "I mean, it's not like you've got any special mind powers, other than being way too smart." "Well, I'll have powers eventually," Starflight had huffed. "Maybe it's something Nightwings develop when we're older. You're supposed to be studying, not making fun of me." "I wasn't making fun," Clay had protested. It was true he'd been trying to distract Starflight from studying, though, but of course, that never worked for long. Now Clay scraped at the floor under the boulder. He actually missed Starflight. More than that, he was worried about him. How had Kestrel reacted when she couldn't find Clay, Tsunami, or Glory? She wouldn't hurt Starflight or Sunny. Would she? Suddenly his claws caught on something. He flattened himself to the stone floor and peered underneath the boulder. A long, sturdy stick was jammed under the rock, holding it in place. "Here," he whispered to Tsunami. He wrapped his talons around the stick and tried to yank it free. After a few tries, he realized it wouldn't come loose, but it did move from side to side. He tried sliding it sideways, and the boulder began to roll. He stopped quickly and looked at Tsunami. "What if Webbs and Dune are waiting for us?" Clay asked. "They can't stop us, not all 5 of us, not if we all fight. The only way they kept us in was by blocking the way out. Once it's open, we'll all be free." Tsunami let out a long breath. "All right," Clay said, gritting his teeth. "Let's do this." He shoved the stick as hard as he could. The boulder slowly rolled aside with a soft, scraping sound. The central cave came into view, and a shiver ran along Clay's tail at how strange it looked from the outside. A forlorn little shape was huddled by the river, trailing her talons in the water. She turned as the boulder moved, and her gray-green eyes went wide. "Shh!" Tsunami hissed quietly, bounding across the cave toward her. Sunny leaped up at the same moment and threw her wings open. She pressed her front talons to her snout, beaming. "You did it!" she whispered. Clay glanced at the tunnel that led to the Guardian's cave. Even if Tsunami was right that Webbs and Dune couldn't stop them, he didn't want to stick around to find out. "Where are the others?" he asked quietly. "I'll get Starflight," Sunny said, heading for the study cave. "Glory, I don't know." She glanced up at the stalactites. Clay felt a stab of worry. Was Glory all right? What if something had happened to her while she was camouflaged? Would she have stayed invisible? What if she had fallen off a stalagmite or flown into an outcropping and hurt herself? What if... "Right here," a voice whispered in his ear. Soft wings brushed his, and Glory's long shape shimmered into view. Her scales shifted from gray and black to a warm golden orange flecked with dark blue. "You're all right," Clay said. In his relief, he twined his tail around hers without thinking. She tensed, but she didn't pull away immediately like she normally would. Instead, she nudged him with her elegant snout. "Of course I am," she said. "I would have been fine on my own, you know." Perhaps she felt his wings droop, because she added, "But thank you for doing insanely dangerous things for me anyway." "Anytime," Clay said happily. Glory stepped back and nodded at where Starflight was staggering out of the tunnel from the study cave. "Kestrel was pretty furious," she said. "I just had to listen to her from my hiding place. Those 2 got the brunt of it." Clay started forward, but Tsunami and Sunny were already on either side of Starflight. For a horrible moment, he thought Starflight was limping. That he'd been beaten or burned or terribly injured by Kestrel. Then he realized that Starflight was moving oddly because he was carrying a giant sack of scrolls on his back. "Oh, no, you don't," Tsunami said, pulling it away from him. "We don't need these, and you've already read them all 1,000 times." "We might need them," Starflight protested, yanking it back. "They'll tell us what's safe to eat." "Oh, no." And all the different tribal customs and how to fly in bad weather and... "You can tell us all those things," Clay said. You're going to anyway. But what if I forget something important? Starflight fretted. Ha! You'd be a lot more likable if you ever did forget anything, Glory said. The only thing that's important is getting out of here right now, Tsunami said, before Webbs and Dune wake up. And before Kestrel comes back, Glory added. What thrilling news! Kestrel is a part of this? I've been looking for her for an awfully long time. The 5 dragonets whirled around. Queen Scarlet was standing in the entranceway. Behind her, the tunnel was blocked by a row of skywings in different shades of flame, all of them large, all of them breathing small spurts of fire, and all of them angry. But none of them looked as angry as the Queen of the Skywings. Chapter 13. I haven't seen Kestrel in what, 7 years? Queen Scarlet said, in a pleasant voice that didn't match the rage in her eyes. What a fun reunion this is going to be! She whipped her tail back and forth behind her. All my least favorite dragons in one place. Clay was the closest dragonet to her. He took a step back toward his friends and spread his wings. She'd have to go through him to get to them. He hoped she couldn't see how his claws were shaking. You followed us here, Tsunami said in a choked voice. Oh, I didn't have to, said the Queen. Someone sent up a lovely, helpful smoke signal for me. Let us all right here. What a brilliant idea. My idea, Clay thought, horrified. This is my fault. I brought the Skywings down on us. Who are you? Sunny squeaked. No, really, this is getting insulting, said the Queen. You're in my territory. Apparently you're living under my mountain, and I am only the most important dragon for hundreds of miles. How dare you not recognize me? She arched her neck and spread her bejeweled wings. Queen Scarlet of the Skywings, Starflight breathed. He crouched low, touching his head to the floor and crossing his front talons together. Now that's more like it, she said, striding into the cave. 3 moons it's gloomy in here. She glanced around, spotted Starflight's sack of scrolls, and set it ablaze with one burst of fire. Starflight stared at the burning scrolls, frozen in place. Clay edged sideways, trying to shield him and Sunny and Glory all at once. If only he were bigger. My goodness, Queen Scarlet said, squinting. You're a Nightwing. She batted Clay aside as if he were made of leaves and grabbed Starflight's chin. Clay scrambled up again and took a step toward her, but the clanking of armor and grim expressions of the Skywings spilling into the cave made him stop. A Nightwing, not yet 10 years old, Queen Scarlet said, turning Starflight around and prodding his scales like he was a cow she planned to eat for dinner. How thrilling! They don't normally let their dragonets out into the world. We might corrupt their superior perfection or something, you know. She breathed smoke into his face, and he coughed. I've never had a Nightwing in my arena before. Thrilling, thrilling! Tell me, what am I thinking right now? Starflight's expression was pure terror. Too hard, Queen Scarlet teased. I'll give you a hint. I'm thinking... Now why would a Nightwing, a Seawing, and a Mudwing be hiding out under my mountain? Along with whatever those two are that the Mudwing is cutely trying to protect. She flicked her tail at Glory and Sunny. Clay shivered as the Queen leaned closer to Starflight. This wouldn't have anything to do with a certain prophecy, would it? What is going on out here? Dune grumbled, limping into the cave. He stopped short at the sight of the skywings. His black eyes turned slowly toward the Queen, and Clay saw fear on his face for the first time ever.
"Webs!"
he yelled, and then the maimed sandwing hurtled across the cave toward the Queen.
"Stop!"
Sunny shrieked.
"They'll hurt you!"
Dune didn't seem to hear her. He seized Queen Scarlet and flung her away from Starflight.
"Don't touch them!"
he roared.
"You'll never get your claws on them!"
The Queen twisted in mid-air and landed on her feet, facing him, hissing.
"They're mine now,"
she snarled. She launched herself at Dune. Webs came pounding into the cave just as the Skywing soldiers erupted toward their Queen. He barely paused before throwing himself in their way. His tail smacked 3 of them back, and his claws raked the underbelly of another. Clay had never seen him fight before. He hadn't known Webs could be dangerous.
"Stay back,"
Clay said to Sunny.
"And you should hide yourself,"
he added to Glory. "Disappear while you try to die for us again?" she said. "No thanks." She pushed past him and went after Tsunami, who was already fighting alongside Webs. Clay shoved Sunny up onto a boulder and ran to join them.
"Wait, I can help," Sunny called. "Can't I?"
"These dragonets are sacred,"
Dune shouted as Queen Scarlet smashed him into a stalagmite. She was smaller than him, but deceptively strong, and his old injuries slowed him down. He staggered up, gasping, with his scarred wing trailing crookedly beside him.
"They're the dragonets of destiny. You can't have them."
"But what if it's my destiny to play with them?" she said, lashing her claws at his stump. He howled, and a stream of blood poured from the new wound.
"Oh, wait, that's right," she said.
"I don't care about destiny. I don't care about prophecies or any of that Nightwing silliness." She scored her talons along his wing, ripping open the scars. "Besides, they made me awfully mad and then ran away. That happens to me far too often. But you know what? I always find the ones who betray me in the end, even if I have to wait 7 years." The Queen seized Dune by the neck and pinned him up against the wall. "Right, Kestrel?" Clay stumbled. The skywing he was fighting knocked him over and trapped his tail and wings beneath 4 massive feet. The battle seemed to freeze for a moment, and from his crushed position, Clay saw Kestrel slide into the cave.
Poor Scarlet," she said bitingly. "Everyone betrays you. Well, you've got me now. Let these worthless others go."
She didn't even look down at the dragonets. Clay twisted his head and met Tsunami's eyes. He would never have guessed that Kestrel would give herself up to save them. Maybe she really meant it about keeping them alive. Maybe that was the only thing she cared about, no matter how much she hated them.
"Kestrel,"
the Queen tisked. "That sounded like an order. Have you switched from disobeying orders to giving them now?"
"I won't fight,"
Kestrel said, her voice cold and hard.
"I'll come with you. Just leave them. These dragonets have nothing to do with the Skywings."
"You will come with me," said Queen Scarlet. "Funny that you thought you had a choice about that. We've got a thrilling trial planned, followed by an even more thrilling execution. But as for these little dragons," she swept her tail toward Clay and his friends, "you can't really expect me to give up prizes like this."
"They're no prizes," Kestrel snorted. "They're useless, every one of them."
"Plus, I'm weird-looking,"
Sunny chimed in from the top of her rock. The Queen's tongue flicked out of her mouth, and more smoke coiled around her horns. "Oh, they're just the new blood my arena needs. It would be terribly sad to let them go. I would be too devastated." Clay tried to heave the skywing off him, but the soldier who had him pinned was too big. He barely glanced down at Clay's pathetic struggles. This would be a good time to call up that inner monster, Clay thought, but no surge of strength or violence or rage answered him.
Take them all,
Queen Scarlet announced. Except this one, of course. She shook Dune lightly, as if she were shaking the fluff off a dead pigeon. He clawed at her talons, his eyes bulging. I mean, what use is a crippled dragon who can't fly? I'm surprised you haven't killed yourself already, Sandwing. But I can take care of that for you.
No!
Sunny screamed, leaping at them. But it was too late. With a chilling crack, Queen Scarlet snapped Dune's neck and dropped his body on the stone floor.
Dune!
Sunny howled. She squirmed past Scarlet and crouched beside him, shaking him with her front talons. His mangled wing flopped, and his scales scraped against the rocks. His black eyes were empty.
Dune, wake up!
Clay was too horrified to move, even if he could have escaped the Skywing soldier. Dune is dead. And it's all my fault. I came up with the smoke signal plan. I brought the Skywings here to kill him. Who else is going to die because of me? Kestrel suddenly lunged at the Skywing soldiers. She grabbed the one who was clutching webs and ripped him free. Tell the Talons, she snarled, shoving Webs toward the river. Before anyone could stop him, Webs pelted down the slope and dove into the water. A huge wave doused the rocks and splashed all the dragons. He vanished below the surface while Clay was still blinking. Clay remembered the tight gap and the long tunnel he'd swum through. Would Webs fit? Would he make it outside? Ooh, Queen Scarlet said, wiping her crest dry with one claw. The Talons of Peace. I hope they try storming my sky palace to save you. That would be thrilling fun, especially the part where we slaughter them all. The Skywing soldiers brought chains forward and started wrapping each of the dragonets in heavy iron. Clay caught Glory's eye. Hide, he mouthed. She shook her head. No way. I'm going with you, she whispered. The weight of the chains made Clay's wings and head droop as they were all marched through the tunnel and out into the dawn. The sun was slithering up the sky, casting golden light across the mountains. Clay glanced up and thought he saw a dark figure circle overhead, spot them, and fly away. He guessed it might be Marosier, but he wasn't surprised that the Nightwing made no effort to rescue them. Nightwings never got their claws dirty. They delivered prophecies and told other dragons what to do, but they stayed out of the war and avoided fighting. Clay's heart ached. They'd come so close to freedom, but now they were far worse off than before. Life under the mountain had felt like prison, but he knew it was nothing compared to being trapped in the claws of the Skywing Queen. Part 2. In the Sky Kingdom. Chapter 14. The Queen's prisoners were kept in the sky. For the whole first day, Clay kept his eyes shut. His talons gripped the rock below him so tightly he started to lose feeling in his legs. One glance over the edge, one glimpse of the dizzying drop below him, and he feared he would lose consciousness and fall. With his wings folded over and clamped in Skywing metal clips, falling meant death. Horrible, painful, bone-shattering death. But then, he wasn't entirely sure if that would be worse than Queen Scarlet's plans for them, whatever they were. His prison cell was at the top of a towering spire of rock. A narrow stone platform gave him just enough room to walk in a circle and lie down. There were no walls. There was no roof. There was only open blue sky and the fierce wind whistling around his ears day and night. On the second day, a hunk of meat hit him in the face. Hunger forced his eyes open. An unusual skywing dragon was flying in loops around his perch. He guessed she was only a year or two older than him. Her horns were full size, but her teeth were still sharp and white, not yet blunted or stained. Veins of gold ran through her glimmering copper wings, and smoke seemed to be coming from her scales as well as her mouth. She stopped and hovered in front of him. Her eyes were startling, like two small blue flames blazing through the smoke. Clay was pretty sure skywings normally had orange or yellow eyes. He wondered if there was something wrong with this one, like Sunny. Something dead and bloody and charred lay on the stone in front of him. Clay took one look at the blood, remembered the shape of Dune's broken neck, and threw up over the side of the platform. To his surprise, the other dragon started laughing.
Oh, gross, she said. Too bad the barracks aren't down there. The guards seriously deserve that.
Unwillingly, Clay looked over the edge. His rock tower prison was one of about 100 spires spread out in a huge circle. Nearly every one had a dragon trapped at the top, like him. Like him, they each had thin metal clamps on the outer edge of their wings. In the center of the circle was a bowl of rock, like an empty lake, with sand at the bottom and sheer walls. Above the walls were rows of benches, balconies, and caves for spectators to look down into the arena. At the bottom of his tower, there was only bare rock. But from up here, he could see the heart of the Skywing Kingdom stretched across the mountaintop. Queen Scarlet's vast palace was carved into the gray and black rocks of the peak. Half of it was inside tunnels and caves, while the other half was open to the sky and bristling with defenses. Fire-colored dragons crawled across the mountain face, digging and blasting out new palace extensions until they were covered in stone dust and dirt and looked no brighter than mud wings. The war had slashed this kingdom with sharp talons. Clay spotted collapsed towers, scorch marks along several walls, and a ravine half full of dragon bones. Even as he watched, he saw 2 skywings carry in the corpse of a crimson dragon and dump it in the ravine. They set fire to the body and hovered for a moment over the smoke, their wings brushing against each other. Then they wheeled and flew away, leaving the body to blaze down into ashes and singed bones. Far off to the east, Clay could see the blue, glittering line of the sea. He also noticed the thin wires that twisted around his legs and neck. He'd been too terrified and confused to pay attention to what the Skywings did with him when they first arrived. The wires stretched from him out to the necks and legs of other prisoners, who all had them as well. One went to his left, to one leg of a moon-silver icewing on the next column, who is asleep with her tail over her nose. One wire was attached to the dragon on his right, a fuming sandwing whose pacing made the wire shake. The last 3 wires snaked out across the circle. He couldn't tell where those wires went. They disappeared into a tangled web above the bowl, connecting all the trapped dragons. So, even if Queen Scarlet's captives could fly away, they'd have to all lift off at once. And then all 100 prisoners would be stuck with each other. They wouldn't get very far that way. He wondered what would happen if one dragon fell off his spire. Would the wires drag down all the others as well?
"Aren't you going to eat?" asked the Skywing, who was flapping around him.
"I'm not hungry," Clay said, tucking his head under his wing. He could hear her wing beats as she circled him a few more times.
"Is it the wrong thing?" she asked.
I don't know what mudwings eat. We've never had one before. You know, because we're on the same side in the war. So that would be rude. Taking them prisoner, I mean. But you're in the Talons of Peace, so the mudwings won't care what we do to you. Come on, you have to eat something.
Why?
Clay asked, keeping his head buried. Because I don't want you to die before I kill you, she said, her tone so matter-of-fact that it took Clay a few moments to register what she'd said. He poked out his snout and stared at her. I've never fought a mudwing, she said, deftly avoiding the wires as she looped around him again. Since we're allies and all, so I'm really curious. I bet it's totally different from fighting sea wings and ice wings. But Her Majesty will make you fight some of the regular prisoners first, and if you die, then I don't get to fight you.
And that would be sad, Clay said.
Right, not blazing at all. The most blazing will be fighting the Nightwing, though. Nobody's ever seen anything like that. What if he can read my mind and knows what I'm going to do before I do it? She tilted her wings and swooped underneath Clay. At least he's eating. Hey, I wonder if she'll make you fight each other. But then, I'd only get to fight one of you. Do you think you could beat a Nightwing? Probably not, huh?
Starflight? Clay said. Is he all right? Where is he?
He stood up and peered out at the circle of prisoners. It wasn't so bad as long as he didn't look down. He could see several blue and green dragons who must be sea wings, but none of the ones close enough to identify were tsunami. Most of the trapped dragons were sea wings, ice wings, or sand wings. They must be prisoners of war. A few were red or orange sky wings. He guessed those were subjects who had somehow displeased the queen. Only one prisoner was midnight black, and he was nearly on the opposite side of the circle from Clay. So far away. Clay couldn't see his face, but he could tell that Starflight was sitting still, in his helpful, terrified stalagmite pose, his head drooping. If only he could read minds. Clay wished desperately that he could get a message across the arena, although he didn't know what he would say. Maybe just that he was sorry for all the times he'd teased Starflight, or hidden his favorite scroll, or whined about studying. See him? Asked the Skywing. He doesn't talk much. Clay snorted. Ask him to teach you something, like how the dragons took Pyria from the scavengers during the scorching. Then you won't be able to shut him up. I'll do that, she said, apparently missing that Clay was joking. He squinted at her. The light up here was too bright, and it was even brighter when it reflected off her smoking copper-colored scales. Who are you? He asked. Are you a guard? Ick! No, I'm Peril, she said proudly. The Queen's champion. What's your name? Clay, he said. What did you mean about fighting me? Why do we have to fight? Wow, she said. Are you serious? Have you been living under a rock or something? Pretty much, Clay said with a grimace. Really? She tilted her head curiously and thought for a moment. All right, that's the Queen's arena down there. She flicked her long, pointed tail at the bowl below them. There's a battle almost every day for Her Majesty's amusement. If you win enough battles, you go free. How many is that? Clay asked. I don't know, she said. Nobody's ever done it. Her Majesty always sends me in after any dragon has a few wins, and I always kill them. She shifted her wings in a shrug. I'm really dangerous. And possibly crazy, Clay thought. How many lives has she taken? Does she keep count? Does she care? What are you looking for? Peril asked. Clay had been scanning the prisoners around the circle since spotting Starflight, but he couldn't see any tiny gold dragons or unusual colors. Where were Sunny and Glory? "The other dragons who were brought in with me," he said. "Do you know where they are?" "The Sea Wing is over there," Peril said, spiraling up above him and pointing to a deep blue dragon halfway between him and Starflight. Clay immediately recognized Tsunami's angry tail lashing. "Boring," Peril added. "I fought plenty of Sea Wings. Easy once you know their tricks." "I bet Tsunami has some tricks you've never seen before," Clay thought. "What about the Rain Wing?" She tilted her head at him. "There's a Rain Wing here?" "You can't fight her," he said quickly. "They have no defenses. It wouldn't be fair." "I do whatever Her Majesty tells me to," said Peril. "But I haven't seen a Rain Wing. They didn't bring her to the arena." "There's a Sandwing too," Clay said desperately. "She's really small and golden and kind of odd-looking." "Haven't seen any dragons like that," Peril said. "But I'll keep an eye out, if you want." She did a slow backward somersault in the air and tipped her wings at him. "I'd better go warm up. Cheer for me." Peril dove toward the arena. He watched her glowing copper shape spiral down onto the sand below. A few other dragons were in the arena, sweeping or checking the walls or guarding the seats. Clay noticed that they all hurried to move away from Peril. Wherever she went, dragons fled, as if she had an invisible cloud of poison around her. None of them would even look at her. Peril didn't seem to care. She strode around the arena as if she knew everyone would clear out of her way. Her head kept turning toward the largest rock balcony, which jutted out of a cave overlooking the arena. Finally, she flicked her tail and vanished into a dark opening in the side of the arena wall. Clay crouched to peer over the edge. He hung on tightly with his talons and fought back the dizzying nausea caused by the view. The smell of the dead rabbit wasn't helping. He wondered if he could hit one of the Skywing soldiers if he threw the carcass from up here. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten. Was it before Marcyr appeared under the mountain? Wasn't that a lifetime ago? But his normally huge appetite seemed to have deserted him. As he watched, dragons started filing into the seats below. Nearly all of them were Skywings, but he spotted the pale yellow and white of Sandwings here and there as well. There were even one or two Mudwings. His heart jumped. His own kind! Did they know he was up here? Would they demand his release if they found out, even though he was supposedly in the Talons of Peace? So Mudwings and Skywings were allies on one side of the war. Clay had never been able to remember that before, but he was pretty sure he would now. If only Starflight had thought of chaining me to a tower above gladiator fights, I might have been an excellent history student then. He didn't know how long it took for the stands to fill, but the sun was blazing directly overhead when two of the guards let out a trumpeting roar. All the other dragons snapped to attention. Across the stadium, heads bent, wings tipped, talons were crossed, and silence fell as everyone waited. Queen Scarlet stepped out onto the large balcony and spread her wings, catching the sunlight in the reflection of her orange scales. The fire-breathing hiss of all the gathered dragons greeted her. Clay knew this sound only as a warning that Kestrel was about to spout flames at him. It took him a moment to realize that the Skywing dragons were hissing with respect. He squinted at the dragons around the queen. Several large Skywing guards took up positions along the balcony, and two of them moved to roll something forward into the sunlight. It looked like a tree with no leaves, a sinuous, curving shape with 4 branches, carved from a single spear of pale gray marble. Looped over the branches, with her tail wound around the trunk, was a dragon the color of deep red rose petals. But as the sunlight hit her, new colors exploded through her scales, constellations of gold sparks, galaxies of swirling violet, shifting pale blue nebulas. Clay inhaled sharply, and at the same moment he heard gasps and murmurs flutter through the crowd below. It was Glory! And she was even more dazzling in the sunshine than he'd expected. A delicate silver chain leashed her to the tree sculpture. It looked flimsy and easy to break, but Glory didn't seem interested in escaping. She stretched her long neck up toward the sun, ignoring the audience, and then coiled herself over the branches again and closed her eyes. The guards positioned Glory's tree in one corner of the balcony, and the Queen stepped forward. "Well," she said, in a sly, smiling voice that carried across the arena and up to the prisoners, "what do you think of my new art?" "Art?" Clay thought furiously. As if Glory's nothing more than a tapestry to hang on the wall, not a dragon with feelings and ideas and a destiny and friends who care about her. But why wasn't Glory fighting it? And where was Sunny? Dragons in the lower seats began to applaud, and soon the whole stadium thundered with the beating of wings and talons. Queen Scarlet settled herself on a large, flat boulder, looking pleased, and flicked her tail for silence. "Bring in the combatants," she called. Peril swept in from the tunnel, waving to the crowd. Clay noticed that the applause was muted, as if most of the dragons weren't really sure they wanted to cheer for her. Meanwhile, 3 of the Skywing guards flew up to the prisoner on Clay's right. One of them seized the Sandwing's venomous tail and held it out of the way. The Sandwing fought, howling angry curses, as the other 2 unclipped his wires and hooked them to a ring in the center of the ledge. Clay thought for a moment that the prisoner was going to hurl himself off the edge, despite the bands that were still on his wings, but the guards gripped him tightly and swooped him down to the sands below. They dropped him in a heap in the middle of the arena. Peril turned to look at him, her eyes glinting. Clay realized with a sickening lurch in his stomach that he was about to watch a dragon die. Chapter 15. Clay didn't want to watch, but he knew that if he might have to fight Peril one day, he should study her technique. He glanced up at the distant figures of Tsunami and Starflight. It looked like they were watching intently too, along with most of the prisoners above the arena. One of the Skywing guards stood in the center of the arena and clapped his wings thunderously until the audience was quiet. He bowed to the Queen and announced, "After 4 wins, Horizon, the Sandwing, formerly and unwisely a soldier in Blaze's army, has been challenged to a match with the Queen's champion, Peril. Claws up, fire ready, fight!" He sprang out of the arena, leaving Peril and the Sandwing facing each other. Horizon shrank back against the far wall, hissing. Peril stalked slowly toward him, tilting her copper wings to reflect the sunlight. Her long tail snaked across the sand. It still looked like smoke was rising from her scales. Horizon crouched, then suddenly leaped over Peril's head and fled to the other side of the arena. He didn't try to claw her or strike her on the way past. He didn't even lash out with his poisonous tail. He just ran away. Why is he so afraid of her? Clay wondered uneasily. Peril turned in an unhurried way and smiled at Horizon. His black eyes darted left and right, searching for an escape. Suddenly, he made a dash for the tunnel. All at once, Peril was in his way, lashing her claws across his chest. It didn't look like more than a scratch from what Clay could see, but Horizon screamed in agony and fell back, scrabbling across the sand. Peril followed, slashing another scratch along his side. Horizon screamed again. His banded wings flapped desperately as if he were still trying to fly. Calmly, almost gently, Peril reached out and touched one of his wings, pinning it to his body. Horizon's screams intensified into one long, ear-shattering wail. Clay couldn't understand it. She was only touching him, nothing more. Then Peril let go, and as she stepped back, Clay saw the scorched talon print she left behind on Horizon's scales. It looked as if she had branded him, burning his skin without ever breathing fire. Clay squinted and realized there was smoke rising from Horizon's scratches. Did Peril have fire in her claws? How was that possible? He looked across at Starflight's slumped form, wishing that the Nightwing was close enough to explain everything to him. Suddenly, Horizon attacked. He flung himself at Peril, slashing at her eyes and jabbing his tail at her heart. Peril whirled, avoiding his claws, and knocked him to the sand. His barbed tail bounced off her scales with a spark like miniature lightning and then burst into flames. Fire engulfed the poisoned tip, and Horizon howled in pain. Clay had never seen anything like it. He'd never heard of dragons setting other dragons on fire just by touching them. Horizon beat his tail against the sand, trying to put the fire out as Peril fainted around him. She darted in to give him another scratch, but before she could dart away again, Horizon turned and grabbed her forearms in his talons. He threw his wings around her and buried his face in her shoulder with a high-pitched, keening sound. Peril froze. Smoke billowed off the two dragons, and black marks crawled along Horizon's wings until they started disintegrating into ash. He crumpled slowly to the ground, and Peril crouched with him, holding him up with her wings. A violent shudder went through the Sandwing's whole body. He let go of Peril and flopped slowly onto his side on the sand. Disfiguring burns had melted his facial features, and his wings were charred into black strands between large holes. His talons had scorch marks in the center of their palms. Clay had a sudden, quick flash of memory. Kestrel had the same scorch marks on her talons. Had she fought with Peril back when Kestrel lived in the Skywing Kingdom? How had she survived? Peril stood up, looking down at the dead Sandwing. A disappointed murmur was starting to spread around the stadium. Her copper wings wavered, and she turned to glance up at Queen Scarlet. The Queen sighed and stood up. "Well, that was boring," she said. She raised her voice to address all the prisoners. "I hope some of you up there are braver than this pathetic creature." Clay had never felt less brave. Peril was clearly a whole new category of monster. If Horizon couldn't beat her, perhaps forcing a quick death, even a horrible one, was still a better choice than being killed slowly for the Queen's entertainment. "Don't worry," the Queen said to the crowd, shaking out her wings. "We have a special treat tomorrow, something we've never seen before. Hopefully this time someone will at least try to amuse me, unlike some dragons." Queen Scarlet gave Horizon's body a stern glare, turning her frown on Peril as well. Peril bowed her head and stared at the sand. "Dismissed," said the Queen with a wave of one talon. She turned and swept away. Clay leaned out as far as he dared, watching Glory sleep while the soldiers rolled her back into the tunnels. Maybe she was drugged. Maybe the Queen had threatened her somehow. Maybe she was sick, or there was something else terribly wrong. He didn't know who to worry about more. Glory? Sunny, who was still missing? Or Starflight, who might be thrown into battle tomorrow? Was that what the Queen meant by something we've never seen before? Starflight was good at maps and dates and facts and tests, but his claw-to-claw combat skills were tragic. Clay wasn't at all sure that Starflight could survive the arena. Chapter 16. As the sun began to sink below the mountains, Clay dozed off, still worrying about his friends. He woke up to the smell of burnt prey and the growling of his stomach. 2 of the moons were high overhead, while the third was a dim ivory blur glowing behind a distant peak. His eyes were finally starting to adjust to the bigness of everything. This view was just about the opposite of what he'd grown up with under the mountain. Clay twisted his head toward the smell of prey behind him and nearly toppled off the ledge in surprise. Peril was perched on the far side of his stone platform, with her tail tucked around her legs and her wings folded in, as if she were trying to make herself as small as possible. Even so, there was only about the length of a dragon tail between them, and Clay could clearly feel the burning heat coming off her scales. It wasn't a warm, basking heat like Sunny and Dune had. It felt like standing too close to an erupting volcano. "Oh, good. Finally," she said. She nodded at a lump of meat on the rock between them. "I brought you something different. Well, I made the guard let me bring it. I hope you don't mind that it's a little crispy." She spread her front talons in an oddly hopeless gesture. Clay peered at the prey, which smelled like smoky duck. He wanted it, but he was afraid of getting any closer to Peril. What if she burned him, even by accident? "I'll be careful," she said, guessing his thoughts. "I'll stay really still, I promise." She glanced around at the slumbering prisoners. "I just thought it might be less obvious if I sat here instead of flying around you." She didn't sound like a monster. Clay couldn't put this quiet dragon together with the brutal killer he'd seen earlier that day. He scraped the duck toward him, then devoured it in 2 bites. It tasted like ash and crunched strangely between his teeth. "Oh dear," Peril said. "That was fast. Do you want another one?" "I'm all right," Clay said. She scraped 1 claw across the rocks. "Do you want me to go away?" "No," he said, and she looked up, surprised. "Stay and talk to me," he offered. "Aren't you afraid of me, now that you've seen what I can do?" "Of course I am," he said honestly. "But you're still better company than the pigeons. All they want to talk about is nest design and who to poop on." Peril barked a laugh. She seemed much more subdued than she had when they first met. He studied her face in the moonlight. Are you all right?" he asked. Peril blinked several times fast. Instead of answering, she said, "That was weird today, wasn't it?" "What was weird?" "The Sandwing. Horizon. The way he just gave up." She opened and closed her wings, and Clay flinched. "Why would he do that?" Peril went on. "It's poor form. I guess I should have pushed him away to make him keep fighting. Her Majesty was pretty angry." "At you?" Clay said. "That doesn't seem fair." Peril blinked again. "Really?" she said. "It doesn't?" She shook her head. "No. The Queen is right. It's my responsibility to make the fight exciting if the other dragon won't do it." "Why do you do what she says?" Clay asked. "Do you like fighting?" What he really wanted to ask was, "Do you like killing?" But he was afraid of what the answer might be. Would he like killing? If he'd been given the chance to do it over and over again with no consequences, was that the kind of dragon he was supposed to be? Would he like it if he had to do it tomorrow in the arena?
Of course, Peril said. I'm good at fighting. And not much else. And she's my queen. I'm her champion.
Why you? Clay asked, risking getting closer to his real question. What's wrong with you?
No one else wants me, Peril said matter-of-factly. No one can even touch me. You saw that. I was born with too much fire. Usually, when dragons like me hatch, the Skywings drop them off the highest mountain peak. That's what my mother was going to do, but Queen Scarlet saved me and killed her to punish her.
Her eyes went cold at the words, my mother. Wow, Clay said faintly.
Yeah, said Peril. If you want to know everything, I burned up my twin in our egg. I sucked all the fire out of him and scorched him to a crisp.
She shrugged, but there was a wobbliness to her voice. I attacked the other eggs in my nest when I hatched, Clay said. It felt really strange to say out loud. At least, that's what the big dragons told me. They said I tried to kill my nestmates. I don't remember it.
Peril tilted her head. So maybe we were both born to kill other dragons, she said.
Clay wished she didn't sound so happy about it. Maybe she's right. Maybe she's the monster I could be if I let myself. I don't really want to do that, he admitted. I like fighting, but the only thing I've ever killed is prey.
Her Majesty said I might as well follow my true nature, Peril said. That's how she raised me, letting me be myself, giving me dragons to kill. Maybe you'd feel better if you could be who you really are.
I hope that's not who I am, Clay said. In the moonlight, Peril's expression changed, and he realized he'd hurt her feelings.
Not that,
he stammered. Nice work, Clay. How are you going to finish that sentence? Not that there's anything wrong with being a killer. Or maybe, but it seems to be going great for you. I mean, maybe I was born that way, but does that mean I'm like that forever? I guess I hope I have a choice is all. I want to be who I want to be, not who I have to be, right? Do you ever... wouldn't you want to be different? If you could be anyone?
No,
Peril said, clawing at the rock under her talons.
I've accepted myself, and I like myself this way. You should do the same thing.
Something clattered far below them, and Peril jumped.
I'd better go, she said.
Wait, Clay said. Please, who's supposed to fight tomorrow? Can you talk to the Queen? Tell her not to send in the Nightwing. He's not ready for the arena.
Are you serious?
Peril said.
She'd be furious. She's so excited to see him fight.
Tell her I volunteer instead, Clay blurted. Tell her I'm ready, and I promise I'll make it exciting. Peril was already shaking her head.
I can't. I'm forbidden to talk to you. She was really mad when she found out I visited you before. I guess you're not like the other prisoners.
Clay paused, thinking. That was strange. Why did Queen Scarlet care if Peril talked to him? But you came to see me anyway? She shuffled her talons and looked a little embarrassed.
Yeah, I don't know why. It didn't seem fair. I like talking to you. Her Majesty never has time to talk to me, and my only other friend is old and tells the same stories over and over again. You're blazing.
So, she doesn't obey every order Queen Scarlet gives her. Good to know. He realized she was looking at him hopefully.
He said. You're blazing too?
Peril grinned, sharp white teeth flashing in the moonlight.
That's what Her Majesty says. She likes me the way I am and nobody else ever has. Until you.
Yikes, Clay thought. He wasn't sure he did like her the way she was, or that he wanted to be best friends with a dragon who was planning to kill him eventually. But there was something not entirely awful about Peril, an awkwardness and sadness that he kind of understood. And maybe there was a chance he could talk her out of the whole killing plan. Maybe that was why Queen Scarlet didn't want her talking to him. In the meanwhile, though, he had to focus on saving Starflight.
Listen, he said. Could you talk to her about Starflight anyway? What if you acted like you came up with it yourself? A mudwing is still something new, right? So send me in first and save him for later. Besides, if he dies in his first fight, that would be a waste, wouldn't it?
He swallowed the lump that rose in his throat at the idea of Starflight dying.
You think he would?
Peril said, gazing out at the circle of prisoners. Even with the bright light of the moons, it was hard to see the dark lump of dragon on Starflight's pedestal.
Can he use his powers? Reading minds and all that?
Poor Starflight. Clay wondered if a normal Nightwing, raised around other Nightwings, would already have his powers by now. He didn't want Peril and Queen Scarlet to know that Starflight was powerless, but he didn't want them to risk Starflight's life because they thought he could do something special.
They're a little unpredictable, he hazarded. He's not full grown, you know. He's still learning how to use them. Although, of course, they're very scary when they work.
He hoped the Skywings had no more information about Nightwing powers than Starflight's scrolls did.
Oh, Peril said. That makes sense.
Her tail twitched over her talons as she thought. Clay tried to sidle a bit closer to the edge, away from her blistering heat.
All right,
she said finally.
I'll try.
Thank you, Clay said. Peril spread her wings to fly away and then hesitated, looking at him.
You wouldn't do that, would you?
Clay tried to think what she meant.
Kill yourself like that, she said. The way Horizon did.
She coughed, and a small ring of smoke puffed out of her snout. Clay had no idea what he would do if he ever had to fight Peril. It sounded even more terrifying than swimming down the underground river. He met her eerie blue eyes and realized that she looked very worried.
I don't think so,
he said truthfully. He couldn't imagine choosing to die that way, and he didn't think he was brave enough to do it either.
Oh, good,
she said.
I'd much rather kill you fair and square. Well, good night.
She leaped up into the air and beat her wings, sending a wave of heat over Clay's scales. He felt very unsettled as he watched her spiral down to the arena. Peril was the first dragon he'd met outside the mountain, if he didn't count Queen Scarlet. Maybe she wasn't as strange as he thought. Maybe switching between friendly conversation and violence was normal for a dragon. But somehow, he didn't think so. Was she right about his true nature? If he'd been raised like her, killing dragons and feeding the monster inside him, maybe he'd be less worried all the time. Maybe he needed to accept that part of him, like she had. But would his friends still like him? Would he be more or less worthy of the prophecy that way? One thing was for sure. Whenever he did end up in the arena, he'd find out how he felt about killing pretty fast.
Chapter 17.
The next morning, 3 blood-red Skywing guards arrived to unchain Clay.
What's happening?
Clay asked nervously as they unclipped the wires around his legs. He'd gotten used to the feeling that something would catch him if he fell, even if it would probably hurt.
Private audience with the Queen,
sniffed one.
Is that a good thing? Clay asked. Or a bad thing? I've never been a prisoner before, unless, technically, maybe I sort of was, but not like this. This is a lot windier. Plus, there's the Queen. That's new. Does she normally meet with prisoners, maybe right before letting them go?
Shut up,
snapped the guard who had answered him before.
Right, yes, Clay said. Only I was wondering about the other dragonets who are with me and if I could maybe see them.
One of the guards tightened the wire around his neck and hissed.
Another word and there's going to be an unfortunate accident on the way down to the throne room.
Clay glanced over the edge and shut his mouth firmly. So far, it seemed to him that most Skywings were just as grumpy as Kestrel. With a start, he realized he'd forgotten to worry about Kestrel. The Queen had talked to her as if they once knew each other. He craned his neck, looking for her among the prisoners as the guards flew him down to the arena. But none of the red or orange Skywings on the spires were quite the right color or size. He noticed with a shiver of fear that Starflight's perch was empty. He must have been taken away while Clay was sleeping. But why? As they reached the sandy ground, Clay twisted to look up at Tsunami and saw 3 more Skywings surrounding her. They were having a hard time getting close. She lashed and fought and swung her powerful tail at them in a fury. Oops, Clay thought. Should I have done that? He hadn't struggled with the guards at all. He glanced around the arena, wondering if he should try to run now, but his wings were still clamped, and there was only one doorway out of the arena. Since the guards were already dragging him toward it, it seemed a little pointless to break free and then run exactly where they were going anyway. So he let them lead him into the smoky tunnel, lit with flaming torches, and an occasional skylight cut through the rock overhead. The tunnel was wide enough for 3 dragons to walk side by side, wings spread. It sloped upward through the mountain, into the palace Clay had seen from his prison perch. At one point, they passed a large cave with tall, narrow windows cut into the walls, casting bars of sunlight on the stone floor. A pool of water separated the cave from the tunnel. On one wall hung a full-length portrait of Queen Scarlet, staring majestically down her nose. Clay spotted the glint of a few copper scales on the floor and wondered if it was Peril's room. There was nothing else in the cave. It occurred to him that she probably couldn't sleep on animal skins or read scrolls because her touch would burn right through them. But if fighting was all she was good for, why hadn't the Queen sent Peril out into the war? Why was she kept here for gladiator fights instead? Perhaps Queen Scarlet didn't completely trust the hold she had on Peril. If she were let loose into the world, Peril might realize she didn't have to be a killer. Or she might decide to kill anyone she liked, without waiting for the Queen's permission. Soon Clay heard clattering and clanking and chattering up ahead, as if a crowd of dragons were busily hurrying about. Then the passageway opened out into a vast hall, and he saw that was exactly what he was hearing. He was standing on a wide balcony with no railing, 2 levels up from the ground floor. The balcony ran all the way around the hall in a large square, and above it, Clay could see 5 more levels of balconies, and above that, the open sky. Dragons were hurrying everywhere, glowing in the light. Large windows were cut into the walls all the way up, so the hall was flooded with sunshine. The floors blazed as if little rivers of fire ran through them. When Clay looked more closely, he saw a design of talon prints inlaid with gold, running through the stone under his talons. Gold veins were carved into the walls as well, some of them branching into flames or tracing shapes like clouds in the rock. Clay remembered that the queen must be very wealthy. This showed how powerful she was as well. Even with all this gold at their claw tips, no dragon dared to dig it out and steal it. The guards shoved him in the direction where the gold talon prints led. Clay followed the trail, gazing at the dragons bustling around the hall. Skywings flew from level to level, hopping across the great space and dodging wings and tails as they went. Some of them exchanged small message scrolls in mid-air. Others were carrying buckets of water, or clean animal skins, or platters of food. Everyone seemed either very busy or as if they were trying to look very busy. Clay saw one young orange dragonet winging up to the highest level with a bucket of soapy water clutched in her talons. As she reached the top balcony, her tail tangled with another dragon's and she overbalanced. She lunged for the ledge and dropped the bucket, which plummeted all the way down, whooshing past Clay and the guards. A moment later, there was a clang, and then a furious roar briefly silenced the hubbub. All the dragons in the hall glanced down. A furious and familiar roar. Clay darted to the edge of the balcony and looked down. At the bottom of the hall, under a metal grid, a dragon was trapped like a pinned squirrel. The bucket was rolling across the iron bars. All the suds and water had spilled out over the prisoner. It was Kestrel. She seized the bars and rattled them angrily as a murmur of laughter rippled around the hall. Clay didn't get a chance to see anything more. The guards yanked him back and shoved him along the talon print trail again. He wondered if that was a special cell for particularly bad prisoners, and if so, what Kestrel had done to deserve it. She'd never talked about her life before the Talons of Peace, or why she'd left the Skywing Kingdom. He'd always kind of imagined that she'd been kicked out for being too grouchy. Although now he guessed that would have made her fit right in. He stopped thinking about Kestrel as the guards pushed him into Queen Scarlet's throne room. The Queen was seated on top of a rock column, carved in the shape of clouds, staring down at the dragons on the floor below her. The wall opposite her was entirely open to the sky, revealing a steep drop and jagged rocks below. The gold tracery in the rocks and floor went over the top in here, as if a giant dragon had stumbled around the room vomiting gold all over the place. Clay could barely see at first through the blaze of reflected sunshine. Then his eyes adjusted, and he spotted Glory, laid out along her tree in the sunlight. She had her eyes closed and looked more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. A slow pulse of crimson teardrops wandered through her dark gold and navy blue scales. 2 Skywing soldiers stood threateningly in front of her, barring Clay's way. Starflight was kneeling before the Queen in a submissive bow. Clay broke away from his guards to crouch beside his friend. "Are you all right?" he whispered. Starflight glanced up at the Queen and gave a tiny shake of his head. "The Nightwing is trying to tell you that it's rude to talk to anyone else before the Queen in her own throne room," said Queen Scarlet. "First, you bow to me, and then you stay put until I'm ready to address you all. Really, what are they teaching dragonets these days? It's so very disrespectful." "Sorry," Clay mumbled, trying to match the bowing position Starflight was in. Somehow his talons didn't fold in quite the same elegant way. His wings felt like they were sticking out at weird angles. He peeked under one arm at Glory and nearly fell on his head. Queen Scarlet arched her ruby-encrusted eyebrows at him and sniffed disapprovingly. Clay tried to stay as still as he could. An eternity passed. There were no other dragons in the throne room besides the guards around Glory and the 3 at the door who had brought Clay. There was no sign of Sunny anywhere. Queen Scarlet studied each of her claws one by one. Now and then she sharpened them on the rocks beside her. Finally, they heard a commotion in the tunnel outside. Clay couldn't help looking over his shoulder when he recognized Tsunami's voice shouting curses. A whole pack of skywings came in, dragging the sea-wing dragonet. She had several of the strange wires wrapped around her, binding her talons to her side and trapping her powerful tail. Her head whipped around, snapping at each of them, so they were having trouble moving her more than a few steps at a time. At last they rolled her alongside Clay, and all the guards jumped back. Clay saw with satisfaction that more than one guard had long scratches and bite marks that looked like Tsunami's work.
"Well, hello," the Queen said, looking amused. "We've been waiting for you. I gather you're enjoying your stay?"
"This is an outrage," Tsunami hissed. "How can you treat dragons this way? Especially us. We're the—"
"Dragonets of Destiny, yes, very thrilling," said Queen Scarlet. "I understand you've been underground for the last 6 years, so perhaps you haven't heard not everyone wants this war to end." Starflight shifted a little on Clay's left side, and Clay could tell he wanted to argue, but the Nightwing kept silent. "Personally, I think the war is quite entertaining," the Queen went on. "I pick up lots of contenders for the arena from the battlefield, and it's a terrific distraction for those dragons who might otherwise have challenged me for the throne. No one's even tried in about 8 or 9 years. Saves me a lot of trouble." "So it's all right with you that hundreds of dragons have died all across the world?" Tsunami spat. The Queen gave her a pitying look. "As if you know anything about that. Have you ever been in a real battle? Have you ever seen hundreds of dragons die? Do you know anything, really, about this war?" Tsunami's mouth opened and closed a few times. "We studied it," she said fiercely. "We know it's awful. We know innocent dragons are getting hurt." "Well, it's easy to say war is awful," Queen Scarlet said, waving one talon. "But it's a lot harder to solve these problems without having a war, especially when you're talking about dragons. Fighting comes naturally to us. You should know. You attacked me when you barely even knew me." She flicked her tail forward, and Clay saw the ugly red gash in her scales. He felt queasy and guilty. Could they have done something else instead of attacking her? Would everything be different now if they'd found a peaceful way out? Tsunami looked flustered. "And who should be the next Sandwing Queen?" Scarlet asked. "Burn, Blister, or Blaze? I'd love to know if you've already decided that, from the wisdom and wide experience of your safe little underground cave." "That's not our fault," Tsunami said. "We wanted to be out in the world." Queen Scarlet looked amused again. "That's what you think," she said. "Hilarious! As if you'd have survived this long out here. Your minders did tell you what happened to all the other dragonets born on the brightest night, didn't they?" Starflight inhaled sharply. He and Tsunami exchanged glances, but Clay didn't understand. The Guardians had never mentioned any other dragonets born on the brightest night, like they were. "Tisk tisk," Queen Scarlet said, seeing the surprise on their faces. "Well, I won't go into details, but it was very sad." "Excuse me," Clay said. Starflight trod on his foot, trying to shut him up, but Clay jostled him away. "Ow, stop! I have a question. Excuse me, Your Majesty?" he said. "Where's Sunny? Is she all right?" "Oh, the funny-looking Sandwing," Queen Scarlet said. "I think Burn will like her very much. She collects curiosities. You should see her palace. It's quite horrifying, full of 2-headed lizards and 7-toed dragon talons and stuffed scavengers with the palest skin you ever saw." She shuddered. "That misshapen dragonet will be the perfect present for her." "You can't give Sunny to Burn," Tsunami flared. "We have to stay together." "I can do
Whatever I like, Queen Scarlet said. This is my kingdom.
What about Glory? Clay asked. What's wrong with her?
Nothing's wrong with her, said the Queen. She's quite perfect, if you ask me. A lovely accessory for my throne room.
But why is she all sleepy?
Clay asked. Rainwings are naturally lazy creatures, Queen Scarlet said. Hadn't you noticed? But then, mudwings aren't known for their brains. Clay stared at Glory. Had her eye twitched? Was he just imagining the slight movement of her wings? Was she asleep, or was she listening? Didn't she care what the Queen said about her? You have to let us go, Tsunami said. You can't stop the prophecy, and we'll—
Shush,
said the Queen, and one of the soldiers prodded Tsunami with a long stick. Your spunkiness is starting to bore me. Now listen. In 2 days, we are having a big celebration for my hatching day. I want all 3 of you to be thrilling and fierce in the arena for me. But I also promised my subjects that today's fight would be exciting. So if I put one of you into it, it would be very thoughtful if you could win. So, is the Nightwing up to it? Which of you is most likely to win a battle to the death against, say, an Icewing? Me, Clay and Tsunami both said at the same time. Starflight stared down at his talons, looking miserable. Adorable, the Queen said, narrowing her eyes at them. But seriously. Me, Clay said. I'm a great fighter. Put me in. No way was he going to watch while Tsunami got slaughtered. Especially since the others would need her much more than him to have any chance of escaping this place. You're delusional, Tsunami snapped at him. I beat you all the time. I'm the strongest of all of us. Not all the time, Clay said. And a mudwing would be more exciting than just another sea wing, wouldn't it? He said to the Queen. True, she mused. Just another sea wing? Tsunami raged. How dare you! You know I'm the best fighter! I love your enthusiasm, dragonets, the Queen said, clapping her wings together. Guards, take these 2 away. She flicked her tail at Tsunami and Starflight. The Skywings came toward them, eyeing Tsunami's teeth unhappily. As for this one, Queen Scarlet pointed at Clay. Her eyes were malicious yellow slits. Prepare him for the arena. Chapter 18. It wasn't until Clay felt the sand under his talons and heard the roaring of the dragons in the stands that he realized he hadn't quite thought this plan through. He had no idea what his fighting skills would be like against an unknown dragon. His mind went blank as the Skywing guards dropped a hissing Icewing onto the ground opposite him. Did he know anything about Icewings? The sun was high in the sky, and it was much warmer in the arena than up on their prison spires. Clay could see beads of silvery liquid dripping through the Icewing's glacier blue scales. Above them, Queen Scarlet smirked from her balcony, with Glory sleeping serenely beside her. The same Skywing announcer from the day before strutted to the center of the arena and bellowed at the crowd. After last month's battle with Blaze's army, our Queen's dungeons were stuffed with Icewing prisoners of war. Only 9 have survived. After 2 wins, I give you Fjord of the Icewings! Fjord lashed his tail and snarled at Clay. And in this corner, an unusual case. A mudwing, but not one of our allies. No, this dragonet was found hiding under our mountains, protected by the talons of peace. Is he one of the dragonets of destiny? Not if he loses this battle. A murmur of laughter rippled around the seats, But in the closest faces, Clay could see expressions of uneasiness and, he thought, concern. He spotted a large mudwing in one of the balconies, frowning down at him. "Try to stop this," Clay thought at him, praying hard. "Do something! I'm one of you!" But the mudwing shifted his gaze away, as if he didn't want to watch, but couldn't afford to leave. The Skywing announcer went on.
"If these prophesied dragonets are as wonderful and legendary as they're supposed to be, this should be a showdown to remember. I hope you're prepared to impress us, Dragon of the Mud. I present to you Clay of the Mudwings. Claws up, teeth ready, fight!"
Clay blinked as the Skywing flew out of the arena. He'd never been called of the Mudwings before. It might have been a warmer feeling if he hadn't been surrounded by more than 200 dragons, including Mudwings, ready to applaud his imminent death. He felt quite far from wonderful and legendary.